Chapter 1375, I've been waiting. As he entered the rift, Meng Hao explained, the souls which have been sealed in the 33 hells are all devious rogues. As for the outsider beasts, they have varying degrees of intelligence, but we'll just overawe them with words and threaten them with my cultivation base. They'll back down. This will make it much easier for us to deal with them. Most of the group responded with thoughtful expressions, except for those few who knew Meng Hao. Strange looks could be seen on their faces, and they coughed dryly, but refrained from saying anything. Simply put, you have to terrify them. After emphasizing that point, he led the group into the necropolis. Based on what he remembered from the last time he was here, he quickly led them toward the main temple. As he proceeded along, he could see out of the corner of his eye that everything was as he had left it, bare and almost completely cleaned out. He took that in stride, of course. However, everyone else looked around with wide eyes. Every single necropolis chamber they passed, they saw broken-down walls devoid of frescoes, and floors which had been completely cleared of tiles. Many areas were so lacking in decoration that they almost seemed to have been gnawed clean by dogs. Gasps could be heard coming from the mouths of the chosen. Not good, someone's actually been in here before. What brutality. Whoever came here before cleaned everything out, everything's gone. I can't believe that they didn't even spare the floor tiles. Damn it, don't tell me it was the outsiders. The chosen were all shaken by what they were seeing, even Li Linger and the others who knew Meng Hao. Only Chen Fan hesitated for a moment, then glanced over at Meng Hao. Meng Hao was in the lead position, and when he heard the things everyone was saying, he couldn't help but feel a bit embarrassed. Instead of launching into an explanation, he merely increased his pace, leading the gasping, astonished group all the way to the central necropolis temple, where greed was sealed. When they arrived, the chosen burst into a commotion at the sight. This was the largest necropolis chamber of all, and also the one which had been most thoroughly looted. With the exception of the very centralmost area, everything had been completely and utterly cleared out. This is preposterous. There's not even a spot of mold left behind. Damn it, this was definitely the outsiders. The chosen were all completely incensed. However, it was at this point that a face suddenly appeared within the ball of soul fire in the central area. That face appeared to be completely enraged. Damn it, it's you again. What are you planning to do this time? You scammed away a bunch of my life force essence and looted all of the funerary objects in my necropolis. You even dug up the floor tiles and stole the frescoes. Damn it, you bastard, you left nothing behind. What do you want now? Meng Hao, a begrieved howl echoed out through the entire necropolis. The group behind Meng Hao gasped and shifted their gazes to look at him. It was almost as if they were truly seeing him for the first time, and strange expressions appeared. They had been incensed at whoever it was who had gone so far as to even scrape up the floor tiles of all the areas they had passed. How could they ever have come to the conclusion that the culprit was actually Meng Hao? This. Ahem, the exalted crown prince truly is formidable. Everyone began to chuckle wryly, and when they glanced at Meng Hao, odd looks could be seen in their eyes. Gradually, the image of Meng Hao which they had built up in their minds was being subverted. Suddenly feeling a bit down, Meng Hao frowned and gave a cold harumph as he strode over toward the ball of soul fire. In response, a scream echoed out from within the fire. Stay away, damn it. Get back, you shameless bastard. You're even more shameless than the jinx from way back when. Meng Hao looked back at the chosen and explained, I already absorbed some of this soul fire a few years ago. What's left is just a fragment. It won't help you people now. With that, he extended his right hand. Ignoring the screams from the face, he made a grasping motion, causing the soul fire to be dragged over into his hand. That in itself caused the ceiling columns which surrounded it to collapse. Then Meng Hao clenched his hand tightly into a fist, causing the soul fire to disappear into his palm. After absorbing it, he stepped into the previously sealed area. Clearing his throat, he hesitated for a moment. After a moment of thought, he ignored the people behind him, produced a flying sword, and proceeded to pry up all of the floor tiles, even as everyone watched. The chosen stared with slack jaws at the incredible proficiency with which Meng Hao quickly cleared out the entire area, even going so far as to collect up the collapsed columns. Then, after brushing off his sleeves, he suddenly stamped his foot down onto the ground, causing a rift to appear. All right, let's go to the second hell. As Meng Hao stepped into the rift, the chosen exchanged dazed glances. Meng Hao's behavior just now had completely toppled any previous notions they had about what he was like. After a short moment of hesitation, they followed him into the rift. In the second hell, they once again bore witness to Meng Hao's domineering personality. Can you sense my murderous aura? Well, let me tell you. I killed a paragon, enslaved another, and then forced a third one to self-detonate. In the second hell was an outsider beast formed completely from flames. Currently, it was trembling in the face of Meng Hao's aggressiveness. Considering the pressure and aura that radiated off of him, the beast was completely terrified. Then the Chosen watched as Meng Hao scraped the second hell's necropolis completely clean. It was as if a gale wind had passed, leaving behind not even a single blade of grass. Habits like that and such personality traits could not simply be changed. Meng Hao then realized that doing everything on his own was taking too long, so he quickly called the other Chosen over for assistance. Come, we don't have much time, he said. Give me a hand here, help me clear this place out. Chen Fan laughed loudly and quickly stepped forward to help. Li Linger covered her mouth and Jai Yin's face darkened. Wang Yaokai's lips continued to twitch. As for the other Chosen, they exchanged embarrassed glances and yet couldn't bring themselves to refuse and quickly began to help. This was something the likes of which they had never done before. All they could do was sigh inwardly and tell themselves that maybe the reason Meng Hao was so powerful was because he did things like this. After scraping everything clean, they eventually reached the central necropolis temple of the second hell. The soul fire there was much more powerful than greed, and as soon as the group entered the hall, an incredible pressure exploded out. However, Meng Hao merely snorted coldly. Unleashing his cultivation base, he stepped forward and suppressed it. With Meng Hao's current cultivation base, bolstered by the blessing of the power of the mountains and seas, coupled with the restrictive spells within the necropolis, it was a simple thing for him to suppress the souls here. Roars echoed out from the soul fire, and yet there was nothing it could do to fight back. It was here that one of the 33 Chosen was left behind to absorb the good fortune that was the soul fire of a powerful expert from the past. If this Chosen failed, he would die, but if he succeeded, his cultivation base would advance by leaps and bounds. If he went so far as to sacrifice some of this longevity, then he would leap past the Tao sovereign level to become an imperial lord for a full 60-year cycle. After leaving one of the Chosen behind, Meng Hao led the group into the third hell, then the fourth hell and the fifth hell. As they went along, he cowed the outsider beasts with his tale of killing and enslaving paragons, of forcing them to self-detonate. At first the Chosen stared in shock, but eventually they got used it and finally grew indifferent. Furthermore, the nervousness they had felt upon entering the 33 hells gradually faded away. After watching Meng Hao suppress one soul fire after another, and leaving behind various Chosen to absorb them, they gradually grew very much at ease. In the end, Meng Hao didn't even need to say anything. As soon as his murderous aura spread out, the other Chosen would jump in to help proclaim his words. He killed a paragon, enslaved another, and forced a third to self-detonate. Scared, well, screw the hell off. Eventually, Meng Hao didn't even need to organize the efforts to clear out the necropolises. The strange feeling the Chosen had at first was long gone, and now they were very familiar with the process. In the end, they even exceeded his expectations, finding certain areas that he hadn't noticed and clearing them away. Meng Hao couldn't help but sigh in praise. Eventually, the weight of their burden and the wariness they had felt when they had first entered this place was completely gone. Now, their journey into the 33 hells seemed more like a vacation. 7th hell, 8th hell, 9th hell. The number of Chosen who were following Meng Hao grew fewer and fewer. At each soul fire, he left behind a Chosen who would laugh and say goodbye to Meng Hao and the group. However, behind their laughter was staunch determination and decisiveness. Crown Prince, I'll be fine here. I hope you clear even more things out than we have so far. Fellow Taoists, I wish you luck in acquiring your good fortune. It was in such fashion that farewells were made at every soul fire location. Time passed, 15th hell, 16th hell, 17th hell. Eventually they passed through the 31st hell, then the 32nd, and finally the 33rd. It took roughly a month for Meng Hao to pass through all 33 hells. By that time, there were no Chosen in his company. In a few of the soul fire locations, the soul fire was far too formidable for a single Chosen to absorb, and he had left behind more than one. Therefore, by the time he reached the 33rd hell, he was alone. The 33rd hell was in the deepest region of the void, and upon entering, Meng Hao saw a young man sitting cross-legged atop a mountain peak. He wore a green robe and gave off an icy feeling. Apparently, whoever this was, it wasn't his true form but rather a clone. An alcohol flagon rested in front of him, from which he would occasionally sip. Down below, at the base of the mountain, there was a wide valley, which was completely empty. As Meng Hao approached, he looked around with flickering eyes, until his gaze eventually came to rest upon the young man. For some reason, this place felt different than the other 32 hells. There was no necropolis, no outsider beast, no soul fire. There weren't even any seals or restrictive spells. It was as if Paragon 9 seals hadn't left any restraining measures here at all. The green-robed man on the mountain seemed very strange to Meng Hao. He was obviously a clone, and yet his cultivation base was unreadable. In one moment he seemed to seethe with unending rage, and in the next he seemed calm and peaceful. The young man looked up at Meng Hao, and his eyes flickered with ancientness. "So you've finally come. I've been waiting a long, long time for you." Chapter 1376, The State of Clear Water. Meng Hao's eyes glittered as he stared at the green-robed young man. Saying nothing, he walked forward and then appeared on the mountain peak. "I've been waiting for you for a long time," the young man murmured. "In fact, it's been so long I've lost track of exactly how much time has passed. I just vaguely remember that I fought a man once. We had a wager going, and if I lost, I promised to do a favor for him. I promised to wait here for someone, to give that person my hexing magic." Meng Hao's eyes began to shine as he said, "Your Excellency is." "I forgot. This isn't my true form, it's only a clone. I forgot what my name was. I only remember that place." The young man shook his head and pointed down toward the valley at the base of the mountain. Meng Hao looked down in the same direction, but didn't see anything other than the valley itself. "Can't see it? Well, that's nothing unusual. My hexing magic has many names. Back then, that man I fought told me that he had a similar hexing magic, although it wasn't as close to its fundamental essence as mine. He speculated that, years later, someone from among his successors might be able to use his first hex to unravel the other hexing magic he had. However, because of the bizarre nature of that particular hexing magic of his, it seemed unlikely that it could be passed down from generation to generation. Therefore, he hoped that I would be able to wait here for the right person and pass on my hexing magic to him." The young man smiled, looked Meng Hao calmly in the eyes, and said, "After all the years that have passed, you are the first person to ever come to me. Apparently, you are the person I've been waiting for. Come." Meng Hao studied the young man for a moment, then smiled. He felt no fear nor any reason to defy him. He approached, and as he did, the young man's eyes glowed with praise. After Meng Hao came to stand directly in front of him, the young man said, "Now take another look." Meng Hao turned to look back at the valley at the foot of the mountain. In that very instant, light and color exploded in his eyes. The once empty valley now had a walled city inside of it. Apparently, it was an entire country, complete with a forbidden palace, nobility, and commoners. The city itself was populated by over 100,000 people. Most shocking of all to Meng Hao was that among all those people, regardless of whether they were young or old, man or woman, from the emperor down to the common people, everyone had exactly the same aura. That aura also matched the green-robed young man's. Perhaps ordinary cultivators wouldn't notice these phenomena without deep study. However, Meng Hao noticed it, and in that same moment, the ancient demon sealing Jade within his bag of holding began to vibrate. Soon, Meng Hao realized that all of those more than 100,000 people were clones. They were all clones of the young man in the green robe. Meng Hao took a deep breath as he studied the city down below. The emperor was studying various reports, the concubines were bickering in the harem, the ministers were enjoying life, the common people were spending time with their families, and the streets were abuzz with activity. Street peddlers called out, people ate and drank, people argued and fought, people laughed and joked. The voices merged together into a cacophony that made the entire city seem incredibly realistic. In fact, it was almost impossible to believe that the entire place was actually populated by an entire world of clones. Furthermore, the name of the city was written above the city gate. It was 3 characters long. State of Clear Water. This hexing magic isn't something that was passed down to me by my master. I gained enlightenment of it myself. Not even my junior brother could use it. Ah, well, it doesn't matter. I'll pass it on to you to resolve this bit of karma. 1. Renegade Immortal info incoming. It seems highly likely that this is a reference to the country of the same name which appears in Renegade Immortal as early as chapter 105. Furthermore, a person with the same name was a supporting character who viewed MC Wang Lin as his junior brother. which makes it likely that the junior brother mentioned in this passage is Wang Lin. That character hasn't appeared in the translation yet, but will eventually. If you transliterate clear water, it becomes Qing Shui, which would be that character's name. Whether or not you can master it will depend on your luck. The young man shook his head and smiled. Paying no more attention to Meng Hao, he turned and floated up into the sky. I've already forgotten how many years have passed. Finally, I can live up to the agreement. And now, the time has come for me to leave. I'm only a stream of divine will, really nothing compared to my true form. I've been gone a long time and I miss some of those old faces from the past. Well, I'm off then. The young man waved his sleeve, and as he floated higher into the air, he gradually began to glow blurry. Soon he turned into countless motes of green light which spread out and then vanished. Meng Hao looked back down at the valley and realized that everything was becoming blurry. He immediately sat down cross-legged and focused his mind. He watched as the figures down below began to fade away. The city began to dissipate, and even the words "state of clear water" vanished. Soon, the only thing left behind was the valley. Hexing magic, demon sealing hexing magic. With the exception of the hexing magic I need to create, I've collected all of the others except for the first and the fourth. Clearly, this isn't the first, which means that it must be the fourth hex. Meng Hao's mind trembled. Based on his current cultivation base, he actually didn't need much qi and blood, or energy of heaven and earth to step into the bottleneck that would come before a breakthrough. Right now, he actually had two paths available to him. One path was to completely pass through the ancient realm. The other path was to collect all the hexing magics and then turn them into essences. One of those paths involved cultivating the bloodline of the All-Heaven Tao Immortal. The other was that of the hexing magic of the League of Demon Sealers. They were both valid paths, although the first one would take more time and would require more cultivation base, qi, and blood. Yet what all that yielded was merely an increase in the chances of successfully extinguishing his soul lamps. As far as the second path went, it required enlightenment and good fortune. Meng Hao sat there silently, looking down at the valley. Finally, he closed his eyes, and everything which he had seen earlier appeared in his mind. As he began to analyze it, he slowly slipped into a trance. Most people would have a difficult time understanding a demon-sealing hexing magic by just looking at it once, but Meng Hao was different. He was the 9th-generation demon sealer and already had command of 6 different hexing magics. Furthermore, he had already successfully turned the 8th hex into the beginnings of essence. To him, as long as he had the basic elements of a demon-sealing hexing magic and the right direction, then he would be able to come to an understanding of it. Time passed. While Meng Hao analyzed the 4th hex, the 33 chosen within the 33 hells all reached critical points within their processes of absorbing and understanding the soul fires and the good fortune they contained. The 33 hells were very quiet. Simultaneously, time slowly passed by outside in the mountain and sea realm. The war preparations were mostly complete, and the cultivators cherished the last bit of time they had before the rest of the 33 heavens descended, spending time with their dearest and most loved friends and family. Up above in the starry sky, the 17th through 33rd heavens were gradually becoming visible, and it even seemed possible to see the apex of the starry sky. Beyond the 33 heavens, in the void of the vast expanse, were 2 land masses that vastly exceeded the 33 heavens in size, which were approaching with indescribable speed. Their goal was obviously the mountain and sea realm. By this point they were very close. In fact, it was possible that they might arrive, just as the war was finishing. More time passed. 4 months went by, 4 months of waiting beneath a sky that had no sun or moon, 4 months of waiting for the truly abysmal pitch black that was coming. All 34 individuals within the 33 hells were at critically dangerous moments of their transformations. The previous silence was broken by the occasional scream or howl. The process of acquiring the good fortune there was a painful one for the 33 chosen. After all, during the process of trying to absorb the soul fire, they also had to ward off possession attempts. Furthermore, because of the restrictive spells in place, if they were possessed, they would be instantly killed. The exact process was different for everyone, but regardless of how it went, it involved pain. By now, each and every one of the chosen was bedraggled, with disheveled hair that made them look almost like ghosts. However, they clenched their teeth and continued on with bloodshot eyes. I can't fail. I have to succeed. If I have to sacrifice my longevity and end up with only a 60-year cycle of life, then I'll do it to protect my clan. I refuse to die in this place. If I'm going to die, I want to die fighting the outsiders." Explosions could be heard, as well as screams, causing the 33 hells to be filled with tumult. In the very depths of the place in the 33rd hell, Meng Hao sat cross-legged on a mountain peak, looking down into the valley. Gradually, he came to see a valley that was no longer empty. Instead, the vague outline of a city was taking shape. However, that city was not the state of clear water, but Yunji County instead. There was a mountain there, beneath which was a flowing river. People could be seen within the city, vague images without faces. However, as Meng Hao's enlightenment deepened, the figures' appearances gradually became more and more clear. There were men and women, old people and young. They looked different, and yet every single one had Meng Hao's aura. In fact, if he wished to, he could instantly become any of those figures. They were his clones. The fourth hex was a mass cloning hexing magic. Its name was the self-hex. Massive amounts of clones, massive amounts of one's own self. By unleashing it to the limit, any one of those clones could become the seed for a new life. With those clones, reincarnation could never be destroyed. As long as one of them existed, one's consciousness could be awoken. Meng Hao lost track of time, lost track of everything. He immersed himself in the hexing magic. Eventually, more and more people appeared in the city, and he began to give all of them unique consciousnesses. Only by possessing a unique consciousness could they truly think. Furthermore, all of the clones possessed an invisible thread that connected them to Meng Hao. He was like the center, with countless nodes spread out to form a web. Everything within that web was an extension of him. Gradually, the people in the city began to live their own lives, to the point where a newcomer who looked at the scene would have a hard time telling that it wasn't real. However, Meng Hao still wasn't satisfied. As he continued to analyze and gain enlightenment, as the demon sealing hexing magic became more clear, more and more versions of Yunji County appeared. Gradually, those cities all formed together to become a vast country. By the time the 10th month arrived, there was no longer a country surrounding him, but rather 3 countries. Within each of those countries lived countless people, all of whom were Meng Hao. It was at this point that among the 33 chosen, some died and some emerged. Important note, Zhen accidentally went directly from 1376 to 1378. There is no chapter 1377/expand. The first to emerge was none other than Wang Yaokai. In the beginning, he was not among the most powerful of the group of chosen. Quite to the contrary, his cultivation base had been the lowest. He was even the worst in terms of latent talent. However, his willpower and determination was something that left even Meng Hao impressed. The entire 9th mountain and sea had witnessed his vicious tactics and were left rattled. In order to join a powerful sect, and in order to pursue the Tao, he had dug his own eyes out, all in order to fix within his mind that final image, that final Tao projection he had seen before losing his sight. He acted the same within his sect. However viciously he treated others, he treated himself even more so. When others in the 33 hells had cried out in anguish because of the pain, his reaction had been to laugh. He laughed viciously the entire time he absorbed the good fortune of the soul fire, and did not hesitate to sacrifice some of his longevity and life force essence in exchange for an incredible advancement in cultivation base. He completely passed beyond the ancient realm and stepped into the Tao realm. He became a Tao lord, a Tao sovereign, and finally, an imperial lord. In the end, the will which existed in the soul fire was also moved by Wang Yaokai's ruthlessness and relentlessness. Eventually, it too began to laugh, and almost willingly allowed its life force to merge into Wang Yaokai. After breaking through and then emerging, he transformed. His hair was white as if with age, but when he sent his cultivation base power surging out, everything went dark, and the entire world of the 33 hells shook. More people came out after Wang Yaokai, but few had made such incredible progress. It wasn't until Li Linger emerged, with hair as white as Wang Yaokai's, that another aura similar to an imperial lord's radiated out. Li Linger's appearance had changed. She was no longer young. Instead, she looked like an old woman. She had forsaken her youth and beauty in exchange for a shocking cultivation base. In 60 years, she would die, but that was her choice. In contrast to what Meng Hao would have predicted, Chen Fan did not choose to sacrifice his life force, nor did he even reach the level of a true Tao sovereign, but rather the 5 essences level. He came out slowly, a seemingly emotional expression on his face, almost as if he were hesitating about something. Jia Yin, on the other hand, chose to make the same decision as Li Linger. As the Chosen flew out, energy surging, the entire 33 hells trembled. Of the entire group, 24 emerged with the other 9, being forever interred within the 33 hells. They had failed in their attempt to acquire good fortune and were dead for all eternity. As for the 24 chosen who did acquire good fortune, 8 of them had chosen to sacrifice some of their longevity. That group acquired cultivation-based power equivalent to an imperial lord. Of the rest, more than half were now as strong as true Tao sovereigns, with a few being at the 5 essences level or so. Regardless of the final outcome for each individual, their fates had completely changed now that they had successfully emerged. As they came out, the hells crumbled behind them, layer by layer. Then, they collectively chose to wait for Meng Hao. During the 10 months that had passed, all of these people who had obtained good fortune had been unable to sense the progress of those around them. Now, when they sent their cultivation-based power out, they could tell that Meng Hao was still in the deepest 33rd hell. As the various hells collapsed, outsider beasts emerged, but didn't dare to even get near the group which was waiting there. Several more days passed, but Meng Hao still hadn't come out. As they waited there silently, they could tell that Meng Hao's aura was gradually fading away, which caused them to frown and look to the cultivator among them with the most powerful cultivation base, Wang Yaokai. After a long moment passed, Wang Yaokai turned and headed toward the exit of the 33 hells, simultaneously speaking to everyone behind him. "Let's go. The fighting outside will begin soon. Waiting here is pointless. The good fortune Meng Hao seeks will surely be greater than ours. Naturally, he needs more time than us. I only have a single 60-year cycle of life, and I don't want to waste any of it. I want to fight." Despite the fact that his eyes were nothing but dark pits, they somehow seemed to glitter with a strange light. Even as his words continued to echo about, he vanished through the exit. The other chosen looked around silently, then clasped hands and bowed to the collapsing hells. Finally, they turned and flew out. Li Linger sighed inwardly and followed them. As for Chen Fan, he seemed to be in somewhat of a daze. Looking down at the hells, it seemed as if he were peering into their deepest depths, but if one looked closely, one would see that he was actually gazing at the place where he had acquired his good fortune, the 19th hell. "How should I choose what to do?" he thought bitterly. Looking away, he concealed the confusion inside of him and flew away. Meanwhile, out in the mountain and sea realm, the final battle with the 33 heavens was beginning. The starry sky was shaking, and various areas were being ripped open. Soon, the land mass that was the 17th heaven became visible in complete detail. Above it was the 18th heaven, the 19th heaven, all the way to the 33rd heaven. They were all visible now. Massive pressure weighed down, along with shocking energy. Rumbling filled the starry sky of the mountain and sea realm as the 17th heaven began to descend, as did all of the other heavens, all the way to the 33rd. The starry sky was torn to pieces as a massive tempest sprang out in all directions. 2 figures emerged from the heavens, a man and a woman. In terms of appearance, they didn't seem to be outsiders at all, but rather ordinary cultivators. However, their eyes shone with an indescribable coldness, as if all other living things were nothing more than ants to them. Indescribable pressure radiated out along with them, and as they descended, the mountains trembled and the seas churned. Countless cultivators coughed up mouthfuls of blood. It was paragon pressure, and not that of the 7 essences level, but the 8 essences level. These were the 2 strongest paragons in the entire 33 heavens. These were 8 essences paragons. Behind them was a huge army of outsiders from the 17th through 33rd heavens. From the mere look of it, this army seemed unending, filled with tens of millions of outsiders, all of them exceedingly powerful. There were even some enormous magical items that flew out from the armies. There were statues, tens of thousands of meters high. There were enormous trees and freezing coffins. Even more shocking was that toward the back of the army was an enormous red sun. In addition to all that, there were other legendary types of outsiders. Most astonishing were the giants, tens of thousands of meters tall. From the look of it, those giants could grow even taller than they were now. They had stars on their foreheads and radiated intense, ancient auras. There were other vicious-looking entities who had leathery wings and were extremely conspicuous among the other forces. Further off in the distance were tens of thousands of black dragons, and beyond that, a sea of flames. This time, the 33 heavens were holding nothing back. All of their power was being unleashed in their attempt to destroy the mountain and sea realm. They wanted to strike fear into the hearts of the mountain and sea realm cultivators, and considering the vast size of their army and the presence of their paragons, it really didn't seem as if the mountain and sea realm had any chance of coming out on top. Suddenly, a cold, ancient voice rang out into the starry sky. The outsiders heard it, as did the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. Kill them all, leave no one alive. It was one of the two eight essences paragons, the woman. In response to her words, the huge army of outsiders let out a roar that could shake heaven and earth. Then, they poured toward the mountain and sea realm like floodwaters. As for the female paragon, she turned into a beam of light, her energy sweeping about as she closed in on the shield which had been formed over the past 10 months to protect the mountain and sea realm. The single swipe of a finger caused cracking sounds to emanate out from the shield, which then shattered. Countless fragments of the shield exploded out in every direction, whereupon the paragon took a step forward, to appear on the fifth mountain. There, she stamped her foot, causing rumbling sounds to echo out. Then, in the blink of an eye, the mountain collapsed. The cultivators of the mountain and sea realm stared in shock at this sudden development. However, it was in the same moment that cries rang out from different areas within the mountain and sea realm. Suddenly, 3 temples appeared in the vicinity of the female paragon. Within those temples were 3 old men. They were none other than the Diyens. The 3 great Diyens of the mountain and sea realm were no longer hiding in the shadows. They appeared all at once to suppress the female paragon. At the same time, Meng Hao's paragon puppet was joined by Paragon Sea Dream to also attack the same paragon. Further off in the distance, the 3 great Taoist societies gathered their disciples and magical devices, drawing fully upon all of their resources to meet the army of outsiders. Beyond that position, Su Qing sat in a command pavilion, constantly sending out orders into the army of mountain and sea cultivators, coordinating the deadly battle with the outsiders. The members of the Fang clan, as well as other sects and clans, all appeared on the battlefield to fight. There were even people from the Wang clan. The chaotic final battle was now underway. However, up in the starry sky, there was another 8 essences paragon, the man. His expression remained calm as he turned his gaze to the depths of the mountain and sea realm, to planet South Heaven in the 9th mountain and sea. "So it's you," he said softly. He took a step forward, vanishing. Unexpectedly, when he reappeared, he was in the heart of the mountain and sea realm, directly outside of planet South Heaven. In almost the moment he appeared, planet South Heaven's spell formation erupted with killing intent. The 8 essences paragon completely ignored it, though, stepping forward to appear on a certain mountain peak on planet South Heaven. That mountain peak was where Shui Dongliu stood. He spun around to face the 8 essences paragon, and when their eyes met, no words were spoken. They both vanished, and in the wake of their departure, a massive boom echoed out, which completely leveled the mountain and the lands beneath their feet, leaving behind only a huge crater. That crater led to the core of planet South Heaven, where a flaming sea of magma existed. It was in this exact moment that, back in the collapsing 33 hells, Meng Hao's eyes suddenly opened. He looked around to see all of the cities and the people in them, and suddenly, everything stopped moving. Gradually, the scene around him transformed into shimmering motes of light which floated toward Meng Hao, and them merged into him. His eyes then began to glow with shining light. Chapter 1378, 8 Essences Arrive. Chapter 1379, Incredible Power. The 4th hex, self-hexing. Meng Hao watched the world vanishing in front of him, and all of the various clones of himself fading away. Finally, he rose to his feet. His cultivation base had not experienced any transformations, but now, he no longer had 6 hexing magics but 7. I'm now only 2 hexing magics away from the full 9. One of them is the original 1st hex, and the other is my own 9th hex, the final one. As Meng Hao thought back to all the different times he had acquired hexing magics throughout his life, he sighed. Turning, he waved his hand, causing his soul lamps to appear. He had a total of 33, with 10 of them being extinguished and 23 still burning. There are 7 desolations, and I have already passed the first 2. Now, after having consumed the power of Paragon Mythdragon, I can start the 3rd desolation. Meng Hao's eyes shone with a bright light as he focused on his 11th soul lamp. The 3rd desolation, the desolation of the heart. After a moment of thought, Meng Hao extended his right hand and pointed at the soul lamp. A wind blasted out and the flame was extinguished, transforming into green smoke that poured into Meng Hao's eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. As he closed his eyes and sat down quietly, there were no changes to his fleshly body or to his soul. However, his heart felt as if an enormous hand had begun to squeeze down on it. Thump thump. Meng Hao's face paled as pain stabbed into his heart. In addition to the pain afflicting the actual organ, his figurative heart also filled with pain. It was like endless grief and loss that turned into complete emptiness. Sweat began to pour down his forehead, and he began to tremble. There were no hallucinations, but the pain made him feel as if the entire world was dead, and he was the only thing left in heaven and earth. "No," he murmured. Suddenly, he threw his head back and bellowed, a sound filled with intense pain. It was as if he could not bear such loneliness and wished to tear apart the heavens and everything else. The 33 hells were still in a state of collapse, but when his powerful cry echoed out, a blast of energy erupted out above him, smashing into the lands above him, creating a huge vortex. Countless ruins and pieces of rubble swirled into that vortex, with Meng Hao at the very center of it. There were also dozens of outsider beasts, all of them trembling as they looked at Meng Hao. Apparently, the pressure and emotion radiating off of him were affecting them. The 7 desolations. Sounds impressive, but they are truly only 7 tribulations, 7 torments. Meng Hao opened his eyes and then slowly reached up to rub his chest over the location of his heart. The 3rd desolation, the desolation of the heart. Sighing, he stood. His cultivation base had increased by a bit. Before, he had already exceeded the level of an imperial lord, and yet was still a step away from the paragon level. With this current increase, he couldn't quite complete that step, but he was immeasurably close. As he looked around, his energy surged, encompassing all of the collapsing 33 hells and all of the outsider beasts, and causing incredible pressure to weigh down. "Acknowledge allegiance or die," he said, not by means of his voice but by means of divine will. All of the surrounding outsider beasts could immediately detect his words. They had already been terrified by the murderous aura Meng Hao emitted, having killed a paragon. In response to his words, they maintained silence and eventually bowed their heads. In that instant, Meng Hao transformed into a beam of light that shot toward the exit, followed by the roaring group of outsider beasts from the 33 hells. "The 10 months have passed," he murmured. "The fighting must have already resumed outside." He increased his speed and moments later shot out of the exit. By the time that Meng Hao burst out from within the 33 hells, fierce fighting had erupted within the mountain and sea realm. Tens of millions of outsiders were attacking viciously. Because of the numerous Dao realm experts present, as well as the giants, the mountain and sea realm was being pushed back in successive losses. It was in that exact same moment that Wang Yaokai and the others returned from the 33 hells. Without the slightest hesitation, they waded into the fighting, finding the powerful experts among the outsiders to do battle with. The addition of these more than 20 chosen, in concert with the mountain and sea lords, ensured that the disparity between the two forces, elite-level cultivators, was not as great. Now, the mountain and sea realms' retreat slowed. An 8 essences paragon destroyed the 5th mountain with the stomp of a foot, and yet that very same paragon was now being pinned down by Sea Dream, the paragon puppet, the 3 great Diens, and others. However, they were not her match. The female paragon snorted coldly and then performed an incantation gesture, causing an enormous vortex to sweep out in all directions. "Are you mmmmblllly?" Blood sprayed out of Sea Dream's mouth, and the same thing happened to the 3 great Diens. The paragon puppet's chest caved in. Everyone was forced to retreat, being completely incapable of standing in the way of the 8 essences female paragon. "What a bunch of insects," she said. A single step took her past the entire group into the 6th sea, where she reached out and pushed her hand down viciously. Instantly, a ball of green flame appeared in her hand, which rumbled down into the water. It only took a moment for the entire 6th sea to begin to boil and dry up. Countless denizens of the 6th sea screamed in agony as they succumbed to the heat and died. The 6th sea was destroyed. The entire battle now seemed somewhat one-sided. Although the mountain and sea realm had evened the odds in terms of the elite-level cultivators, the 33 heavens were fighting with everything they had at their disposal. The giant's skin was incredibly tough, and every stride they took forward was something the mountain and sea cultivators were powerless to stop. If they tried, they were crushed into pulp. The army of tens of millions of outsiders pushed the mountain and sea realm cultivators back with deadly force. Miserable screams rang out as the mountain and sea cultivators were powerless to do anything except retreat. Gradually, a distinct sensation of despair began to grow within the hearts of the forces of the mountain and sea realm. Faced with this level of power, it was as if their previous preparations had all been for naught. This war has gone on for long enough, said the Eight Essences paragon, her voice cool. Today, it ends. She took another step forward toward the sixth mountain. Her goal was clear. She wanted to destroy each mountain and sea in the realm as quickly as possible. When that happened, only the cultivators would remain, and they could be easily dealt with. See, Dream and the others watched with bloodshot eyes, and although they tried to interfere, they couldn't even get close. However, just when the Eight Essences paragon seemed on the verge of setting foot onto the sixth mountain, the 17th heaven suddenly shuddered, as though some enormous force were separating it from the other heavens and sending it toward the mountain and sea realm. However, if you looked closely, you would see that it wasn't heading toward the mountain and sea realm cultivators, but rather the outsider army. This sudden twist caused the mountain and sea realm cultivators to stare in shock. The outsiders were equally astonished. Even the female paragon stopped in her tracks, spinning around to look at the land mass that was the 17th heaven. I should have known that there would be sleeper agents in the 33 heavens, she said, her face darkening. She took another step, this time heading toward the 17th heaven. Then she reached out and made a violent grasping motion, causing an enormous boom to ring out as the entire 17th heaven was shattered. The whole land mass instantly collapsed into ash. Even still, the Eight Essences paragon was unable to determine who it was that had done such a thing. Frowning, she scanned the battlefield but could turn up no clues. It was windswept, he's under strict surveillance. If it wasn't him, then who was it? Well, it doesn't matter. With power like ours, we can crush anything that gets in our path. Snorting coldly, the female paragon waved her right hand toward the sun that existed within the army of outsiders. Instantly, that huge sun radiated boundless light, shrinking down as it shot in her direction. It then swirled around her, quickly transforming into a set of armor. With that armor, the Eight Essences paragon's battle prowess rose even higher. She quickly performed a double-handed incantation gesture, then waved her hand out at her army, causing the outsiders to be stimulated by some unseen force. One by one, they threw their heads back and howled. Their eyes began to glow red as their battle prowess increased, and they then resumed fighting with increased ferocity. Rumbling sounds could be heard as the mountain and sea realm cultivators suffered instant setbacks. The casualties were severe as they were relentlessly shoved backward across the battlefield. The female paragon then turned and headed back toward the mountain and sea realm. Once again, she appeared above the sixth mountain, which she struck with a palm. The sixth mountain began to vibrate, and moments later, its Qianwu turtle shattered. As its agonized scream rang out, the entire sixth mountain was destroyed. The mountain and sea realm cultivators were shaking and in complete despair, and some began to rave. The first to do so were powerful experts from the three great Taoist societies, who unleashed all of the divine abilities they could, some even self-detonated. However, in the moment that the sixth mountain collapsed, three dazzling beams of light shot out from within the rubble of the mountain. Instantly, they locked down onto the position of the female paragon, where they transformed into a triangular sealing mark, completely trapping her. "That's all you've got," she laughed coldly, seemingly taking it all in stride. In her original attempt to destroy the sixth mountain, the sudden development had occurred with the 17th heaven, leaving her no choice but to destroy it. At that time, she had guessed that the mountain and sea realm was now resorting to calling upon sleeper agents within the 33 heavens to try to delay her. In that case, they would most certainly have other tricks planned. Therefore, the sudden appearance of this sealing mark from within the crumbling sixth mountain was nothing surprising. However, even in the moment in which she prepared to cast off the sealing mark, the three Diens, who had only just made their appearance in the battle, suddenly blurred and disappeared from their current locations. Shockingly, when they reappeared, they were positioned at the corners of that triangle. "I am the Sublime Spirit Dien. I am the Tao Divinity Dien. I am the Heaven-Severing Dien. Our mission has been to wait until your arrival and use our lives, use our Taos to seal you tight." Chapter 1380, Three Scriptures Seal the Almighty. We didn't take action before, and even when you first made your appearance, we only focused on defense. Today, we three will repay our debt to the mountain and sea realm. Three Scriptures seal the Almighty. These three Diens were extremely mysterious figures. For countless years, they had never made a single appearance. The scriptures they cultivated had been disseminated in the world, but had not actually been created by these individuals. The Diens were merely the guardians of the scriptures. The three old men sat down cross-legged and closed their eyes, whereupon the magical symbols of the scriptures began to swirl around them and form a sealing mark. They planned to use the power of their scriptures to seal this female paragon. We shall sacrifice our longevity to power the 3 classic scriptures and seal you. It will not be an eternal seal, but it will last long enough to alter the state of this battle. The 8 Essences paragon frowned and waved her right index finger. However, she was incapable of breaking open the sealing mark. Meanwhile, Paragon C Dream and the Paragon Puppet burst back onto the battlefield, using their paragon power to completely change the state of the battle. Really think you can change the tide of battle like this? The 8 Essences paragon said with a laugh. Even as her laughter rang out, a seemingly unremarkable outsider inside the army suddenly began to tremble, then looked up and screamed. Then his body began to swell, and unexpectedly he began to absorb numerous surrounding outsiders. Within the space of a few breaths of time, he had transformed into a huge ball of flesh fully 3,000 meters across, which hovered there in the starry sky. That ball of flesh actually had facial features, and if you looked closely it resembled a head. When the eyes opened, they glowed with coldness. At the same time, laughter rang out. Interesting. It seems that I need to make an appearance after all. The ball of flesh then rapidly shrank down into the shape of a person. It was a middle-aged man wearing a long red robe. He was very odd-looking, with an extremely large head that seemed disproportionate to his body. A twisted smile could be seen on his face, and a murderous aura sprang out as he took a step forward towards C Dream and the Paragon Puppet. As he appeared in front of them, Paragon C Dream's face fell, as did the faces of all the other powerful experts. Even the 3 great Diyen's eyes widened. This aura, you're not cultivators of the 33 heavens, you're from those other 2 powers. At this point, more than 10 other outsiders within the huge army began to roar, grow in size, and absorb nearby outsiders. Soon, more than 10 powerful experts had appeared on the battlefield. Although their cultivation-based fluctuations didn't put them at the Paragon level, based on their battle prowess, they were equivalent to imperial lords. As soon as they appeared, they began to laugh as they charged toward the mountain and sea realm cultivators. Their auras were very strange. Clearly, they weren't mountain and sea cultivators, nor were they cultivators from the 33 heavens. There was even a force of expulsion pushing against them, although it was incapable of actually driving them out. That was because they had not come as their true selves, but instead had used their souls to perform a sort of possession and thus force their way in. Shockingly, one of these new arrivals possessed one of the giants, who suddenly grew far larger than before. Throwing his head back and howling, he charged forth into battle. As he did, the stars on his forehead began to spin, causing an intense murderous aura to flare up. In the briefest of moments, the mountain and sea realm once again began to suffer heavy losses. The 7th sea was no more, and the 7th mountain was being besieged by millions upon millions of outsiders. It didn't take long before that same mountain began to collapse into pieces. Once again, the battle was completely out of balance. As of this moment, there were only 2 seas and 2 mountains left in the entire realm. It was a moment of grave crisis and seemingly impending destruction. Millions upon millions of outsiders were now under the leadership of numerous powerful experts who led them into the 8th sea. However, it was at that point that a light arrow suddenly shot out from the 8th mountain, which almost instantly appeared in front of the giant with the stars on his forehead. Roaring, the giant clenched his right hand into a fist and punched out at the arrow. A huge boom echoed out as the light arrow shattered. However, the giant let out a muffled groan as he staggered backward. Simultaneously, his right arm exploded, and much of his body was severely damaged. Blood sprayed out of his mouth even as a second light arrow closed in. However, that arrow didn't slam into the giant, but rather the 8th sea itself. The 8th sea had long since been laced with restrictive spells, which were now activated by that light arrow, causing the entire sea to begin to roar. Countless rings of light appeared on the surface of the water, which rose up and then exploded in shocking fashion. Instantly, miserable shrieks began to ring out as countless outsiders were shredded to pieces by the explosive restrictive spells. Of course, those deaths didn't count much when compared to the size of the outsider army as a whole, and couldn't even be called a serious blow. The effect on their morale was significant, though. "Who are you?" bellowed the armless, seriously injured giant, throwing his head back and roaring. All of the other powerful experts who had recently appeared also turned to stare at the 8th mountain. There, a bright light appeared, which shot out from the 8th mountain at top speed toward the battlefield. It was none other than Meng Hao. Shockingly, he was followed by scores of outsider beasts. It was impossible to determine how, but he had somehow incited them to follow his orders. Roaring, they shot toward the battlefield with vicious expressions on their faces. The tide of battle was constantly shifting in numerous unexpected ways. Of the two eight essences paragons, one had begun to fight Shui Dongliu, after which the two of them had vanished. As for the other, she was temporarily sealed in place by the three Dians. Paragon C Dream and the Paragon Puppet were currently fighting a desperate battle with the large-headed cultivator. Meng Hao's appearance on the scene changed things once again. He stopped the advance of the outsider army, and yet simultaneously was now facing the charge of the more than 10 recently arrived powerful experts, some of whom were giants. As Meng Hao began to fight them, the army itself once again began to march into the Eighth Sea. Before long, the sea itself was vanquished, and the army proceeded onward toward the Eighth Mountain. It was at this point that a light sigh suddenly rang out, and someone flew out from the Ninth Mountain and seemed to appear in front of the outsider army. Shockingly, behind this person could be seen an illusory world, almost as if he had come from within that world itself. "I've come to help, little brother," said an ancient voice, filled with warmth and kindness. This person was a young man whose expression was that of extreme loneliness. It was as if he should never have appeared in this day and age, and yet here he was. It was none other than Jiusi. He had come from the ancient demon immortal sect, which had long since faded away into history, to appear on this battlefield. As soon as he appeared, another sigh could be heard from the illusory world behind him. That sigh came from True Spirit Night. As the sigh echoed out, Night apparently opened his eyes within that illusory world. In that very instant, fully 1,000,000 outsiders suddenly vanished. When they reappeared, they were in an era of time that no one could see. They were back in the ancient demon immortal sect during its most flourishing and golden era. Instantly, fighting broke out. Jiusi was not the only person to appear at this critical moment in the battle. A Taoist couple suddenly flew out from the Ninth Mountain and Sea. Behind the woman were countless cultivators who had blank expressions on their faces, and yet seemed filled with madness and insanity. As for the man, every step he took caused freezing ice to spread out through the starry sky. It was as if he was walking upon frost soil. These two were none other than Frost Soil Demon Emperor Han Shan and his wife. "Meng Hao, young friend, I've come." Han Shan's appearance on the scene caused ice to spread throughout all heaven and earth. Although his cultivation base was not very high, his debut filled the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm with a new desire to fight, with new braveness. After Han Shan, Lord Jai appeared, as did Grandpa Meng. Then came the experts of the Fang clan. All of the various sects from the Ninth Mountain and Sea joined in. Meng Hao even saw Fatty. Although he was obviously frightened, he instantly flew into battle with the outsiders. And then there was Meng Hao's master, Pill Demon, who also began to fight in this final battle with the outsiders. There were many familiar faces, who all came to the Eighth Mountain to fight. The Eighth Mountain was the battlefield, and it was filled with outsiders and mountain and sea cultivators. Bitter and deadly fighting caused rumbling explosions to echo out constantly. Faced against such an endless sea of outsiders, everyone put everything on the line to fight. Meng Hao was shaken, but there was no time to ponder his apprehensions. He was incapable of going to personally help the people that he knew, and was instead forced to fight these powerful experts who were clearly not from the 33 heavens. Their divine abilities and techniques were things that he had never seen before. That was especially true of the giants, whose formidable fleshly body power was absolutely terrifying. Booms rang out, and people were dying left and right. Meng Hao's eyes were bloodshot as he called upon the full level of his cultivation base to levy one deadly attack after another. He used the mountain-consuming incantation to summon numerous mountains, and he transformed into an azure rock with infinitely sharp talons. The blood demon appeared, roaring, and the Paragon Bridge descended to crush all. Meng Hao was almost like a phantom who flickered back and forth to fight more than 10 enemies at once. A boom rang out as one of the giants coughed up blood. A look of disbelief could be seen on his face as his chest caved in under one of Meng Hao's fist strikes. His heart was shattered, and blood sprayed out everywhere, completely soaking Meng Hao. God blood, not very pure but good nonetheless. Sensing the extraordinary nature of the god blood, Meng Hao flickered into motion, once again leaping into the fighting. Spitting some blood out of his mouth, he faced off against the dozen or so enemies and then began to laugh heartily. Waving his hand, he summoned the copper mirror, which transformed into the battle weapon. Then the meat jelly flew out and became a suit of armor. "All right, bring it on," Meng Hao roared, laughing madly, a ferocious expression on his face. His friends and family were all fighting bitterly. How could he not stand by their side? Off in the distance, the three great Taoist societies were fighting with all the power they could muster. The boom of self-detonation occasionally rang out, as the mountain and sea realm fought with utter madness. By now, they had fought the outsider army to a standstill, and were no longer suffering successive defeats. The outsiders were finally facing the true madness of the mountain and sea realm. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the collapsed ruins of the sixth mountain. "This is all useless. This time, you people will be completely wiped out." It was none other than the female paragon. By now, the three Deyens who surrounded her were withering away into skin and bones. However, they still held on. It was at this point that their disciples flew toward them, sitting down behind them cross-legged to support them with their own longevity. "How long can you keep me pinned down?" the paragon asked. "Your three classic scriptures are extraordinary, paramount Taoist scriptures from the paragon immortal realm. Unfortunately, your cultivation bases are not at the paragon level. Therefore, how could you possibly keep me sealed for any length of time? In fact, are you even capable of holding on right now? The moment that I'm free is the moment that the mountain and sea realm will face complete and utter destruction." Chapter 1381, Fierce Killing. The eight essences paragon remained within the triangular ceiling mark. As she looked out at the mountain and sea realm, she spoke, her voice cool. "The mountain and sea realm is doomed. All bloodlines will be wiped out. Nothing will remain. The fact that you have been able to keep fighting till this point shows that the 33 heavens truly underestimated you people. However, with absolute power like ours, you will fade away into the passage of time. The glory of the immortal world should have become nothing more than ash. The fact that you are still gasping for life will merely ensure that, through all history, immortals will be scorned and derided." As her words echoed out, they could be heard by all of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. "I'm curious, did you people actually think that there was still hope for you? After the 33 heavens are the other two great worlds, the devil realm and the immortal god continent. Those two great powers are immeasurably close. What makes you think your trifling mountains and seas could possibly fight them? Your bloodlines will be expunged. Your minds will be erased. None of you will survive." As the eight essences paragon looked out at the mountain and sea realm, nothing she saw there was worthy of her gaze, not even Meng Hao. Instead, she focused on a location that only she could see between the 8th and 9th mountains. There, the other eight essences paragon was fighting someone who even she could not completely fathom. He was also the only person who could strike fear into her heart. As for the other mysterious experts who existed, either they didn't wish to make a move against her, or for various other reasons were content to simply observe what was happening. "Shui Dongliu, you are simply a body possessed by a discarnate soul. In that case, what exactly are you trying to accomplish? This war was obviously fated to play out this way." The eight essences female paragon frowned. The fact that she couldn't unravel this mystery caused doubt to bubble up in her heart. The war of the mountains and seas continued. The 8th mountain shuddered as the outsider army fought bitterly with the mountain and sea cultivators. Heaven shook and the earth quaked. The starry sky was shattered, and even the 8th mountain itself was beginning to crack and crumble. Paragon Sea Dream and the Paragon Puppet were still fighting the large-headed expert, who fought in a very bizarre fashion. He was adept at using fleshly body techniques, and was able to single-handedly take on both of them, and even prevent them from slipping away to fight elsewhere. In other areas, vicious outsiders fought bitterly with the mountain and sea cultivators. Meng Hao was also in great danger, surrounded by more than 10 enemies including giants. Roars filled the air and the glow of magical techniques rose up. Meng Hao's hair was completely disheveled, and he was going all out with everything he had at his disposal. The life extermination, bedevilment, and god-slaying fists shook the starry sky. Finally, he overwhelmed one of his opponents, who coughed up blood as he was completely annihilated. Meng Hao was gasping for breath as he turned and split the starry sky with the battle weapon. A brilliant cascade of light flashed out toward two enemies, who were completely shocked as their heads flew off of their bodies. Meng Hao's hands were shaking. The price he had paid to be able to kill 3 individuals in quick succession was that he was blasted by the divine abilities from the rest of the group. Even worse, he was hit by a fist strike from the giant. BOM. Blood sprayed out of Meng Hao's mouth, but thanks to the meat jelly, he wasn't grievously injured. Even as he began to recover, thanks to the Green Emperor's eternal incantation, his eyes glimmered with brutality, and he extended his left hand, unleashing the star-plucking magic to grab one of the enemy cultivators. Even as he was about to crush the man's throat, the other surrounding enemies unleashed numerous divine abilities. In the time it takes a spark to fly off of a piece of flint, Meng Hao laughed viciously and refused to retreat. Ceasing his attempt to drag the cultivator toward him, he lunged forward and head-butted the man in the forehead. A boom rang out, accompanied by a blood-curdling scream, whereupon the man's head exploded. Meng Hao was completely soaked in blood and gore, making him look thoroughly vicious as he threw his head back and howled. The surrounding enemies exchanged glances, then suddenly flew up into the air and unexpectedly began to merge together. Their bodies were apparently formed by strange powers and had been pieced together from other bodies. Now, they began to merge together. Even the giants joined in, and in the blink of an eye, all of them transformed into a single new entity. It was a colossal giant, fully 3,000 meters tall, which immediately began to emanate a crushing pressure. Most shocking of all was that the giant had 8 faces on different parts of its body. Those 8 faces belonged to the 8 people who had formed the body, 6 of whom were cultivators, and 2 of whom were giants of the god tribe. Howling, the giant began to charge toward Meng Hao, right hand spinning through the air with explosive speed to almost instantly appear in front of him. Meng Hao's eyes widened, and he immediately summoned the Paragon Bridge to defend himself. A huge boom echoed out and blood sprayed out of Meng Hao's mouth. Even as Meng Hao staggered backward several paces, the giant also fell back, trembling, all 8 faces letting out roars. Meng Hao wiped the blood from his lips, and his eyes flickered with killing intent. Paragon-level power. The giant ground to a halt and glared at Meng Hao for a moment before bursting forward again. As it closed in on Meng Hao, he suddenly opened his mouth wide and unleashed a mighty roar upon Meng Hao. The roar of a god. A shockwave burst out into the starry sky, tearing rifts open. At the same time, the sound waves coming from the giant's mouth turned corporeal as they blasted toward Meng Hao. When they hit him, blood oozed out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. The meat jelly armor began to crack and crumble, although it held on and continued to protect Meng Hao. Meng Hao's right hand quivered as he was shoved back. The sound was so intensely powerful that, were it not for the meat jelly, his organs would already have been crushed into a paste. The giant then strode forward, unleashing a palm strike. Meng Hao, being unable to dodge, met it directly. Blood sprayed out of his mouth and he was flung back. More cracks spread out across the meat jelly armor, and yet it continued to hold fast. Meng Hao felt bad about that, but in this critical moment of life or death, he had to stay focused on the giant. I've seen a divine ability like that before, he thought, his eyes flickering with killing intent. The roar didn't last for very long. However, as soon as it faded away, the giant roared again, and the explosive sound wave once again closed in on Meng Hao. Even as the second sound wave closed in, the starstone in Meng Hao's eye flickered, spreading out to cover his entire body. As the roar bore down, he transformed into an asteroid, which braced up against the sound and then began to move toward the giant. Under the power of the sound wave, the asteroid began to transform into ash, shrinking down rapidly. By the time it was only about 30 meters away from the giant, the asteroid form collapsed, and Meng Hao appeared. However, he quickly transformed into an azure rock, which shot onward at incredible speed. In the blink of an eye, the azure rock was flayed into chunks of gore and blood, but it managed to continue on. Despite the giant falling into retreat, Meng Hao was now less than 10 meters away from it. That distance was enough. Even as the azure rock collapsed, the giant's pupils constricted with fear. It was at this point that Meng Hao's human form stepped out from the remains of the rock. A murderous aura erupted out as he hefted the battle weapon and slashed it down viciously toward the retreating giant. Within the scintillating blade light, the image of a parrot could be seen. The parrot seemed determined, bereaved, even maddened. It was the first time Meng Hao had ever seen it in such a state. The sound of the screaming blade caused the giant's eyes to widen with disbelief, and then the blade slashed into it. Rumble! The giant staggered back, simultaneously collapsing into countless pieces. Numerous miserable shrieks could be heard as the 5 of the 8 bodies which had formed the giant transformed into ash and powder. Simultaneously, roars of disbelief could be heard echoing out from one of the land masses speeding toward the mountain and sea realm out in the vast expanse. Meanwhile, the 3 people who had not been killed were now staring at Meng Hao's blade in terror. Without any hesitation, they began to flee. Meng Hao's face was pale white as he instantly gave chase. His speed was incredible, and he caught up with one of them almost immediately, unhesitatingly grabbing the man and unleashing the blood demon grand magic. Instantly, he began to absorb his qi and blood, as well as his soul, which in turn increased the effectiveness of the Green Emperor's eternal incantation. The cultivator screamed and almost instantly withered up. In the blink of an eye, he became a desiccated corpse. At the same time, Meng Hao visibly recovered, then turned to pursue the other two cultivators. Each one cried the same thing, "Save me." They fled at top speed, shocked expressions on their faces. These were not cultivators from the 33 heavens. They had possessed bodies to come here and were not the type of people who could be killed easily. If they died, they would be resurrected back in their homeland. After all, what had come here were not their full souls. And yet, they had just watched this stranger kill 5 of their compatriots. Most terrifying of all was that not only did their soul fragments perish here, but his bizarre blade caused their true forms to perish as well. Even more terrifying was that this person could absorb their qi, their blood, and their souls. That left them completely shaken and in fear. He can really kill us. How could this be possible? In their terror, they fled at top speed. Meng Hao was just about to give chase when suddenly his expression flickered, and he looked up in the direction of the shattered 6th mountain. There, the 3 Dayens who were keeping the 8 essences paragon sealed were now in a state of extreme withering. That was especially true of the heaven-severing Dayen, who had apparently already run out of life force. "You can't keep me sealed here," the female paragon said coolly. Then she slowly reached out toward the sealing mark itself. Chapter 1382, 3 Scripture Spikes. The parrot had once mentioned that as far as it knew, cultivating the 3 classic scriptures of the mountain and sea realm could lead to becoming a Dayen. Meng Hao had always wondered exactly how powerful Dayens were, as he had never met such legendary figures. It had seemed that they were figures who existed above the mountain and sea lords. However, that was merely what the legend said. In this battle, the appearance of the 8 essences female paragon enabled Meng Hao to finally see the 3 great Dayens, and now he could sense the auras of imperial lords upon them. Dayens were comparable to imperial lords. In fact, Meng Hao couldn't help but notice that there was something strange within the fluctuations emanating from the 3 Dayens. However, by the time he had shown up on the battlefield, the 3 Dayens were already in the midst of sealing the female paragon. Plus, he himself was involved in a deadly struggle, and the intensity of the fighting made it impossible for him to study them closely. However, deep in his heart, that suspicion remained. He distinctly remembered the parrot saying that within the mountain and sea realm, the Sublime Spirit Scripture had its Sublime Spirit Dayen, and the Tao Divinity Scripture had its Tao Divinity Dayen. However, the Heaven-Severing Scripture had never given rise to a Heaven-Severing Dayen. 1. The parrot talked about the Dayens of the 3 scriptures in chapter 338. And yet, it was very obvious that, as of this moment, there was indeed a Heaven-Severing Dayen, although he seemed to be the weakest of the 3, and apparently had already withered away into death. In fact, it seemed that his death was causing the seal to weaken, and prompt the 8 essences paragon to probe for a way to break it. Although Meng Hao hadn't put too much thought into such matters back then, at least now he was able to bear witness to the power of the Dayens. The 8 essences paragon's words were still echoing out when she reached out to touch the sealing mark. Instantly, the triangular seal began to collapse. As it did, the entire area around her was thrown into chaos, which was to be expected. Because of the power contained in the seal as it shattered, the innumerable threads which held the paragon in place began to shudder. They couldn't hold on for long, and as the seal crumbled, those threads began to vanish one by one. The area that was maintained by the Heaven-Severing Dayen was the first to become devoid of such threads. Next were the areas controlled by the other 2 Dayens, who were now in a state of extreme withering. In fact, the 3 young disciples behind each of the 3 Dayens were now virtual corpses as well. As the seal fell apart, the 8 essences paragon was preparing to step out into the open. Once she did, she would unleash her 8 essences cultivation base, and considering that there was no one to stand in her way, the battle would quickly be over. The mountain and sea realm would not even be able to last long enough to see the arrival of the immortal god realm and the devil realm. The realm would be crushed, and all of its people eliminated. However, it was at this point that the Sublime Spirit Dayen suddenly opened his eyes, and they shone with a bizarre light. The disciple behind him also opened his eyes, and his expression was one of complete calm, as though this was a moment which he had prepared for his entire life. "Wire," the Dayen said, "you took me as your master when you were 7 years old. I feel that over the years I never treated you as well as I should have." "Master, I have no regrets," the corpse-like young man replied. "If there really is another life after this one, sir, then I hope I can still call you my master." Without the slightest hesitation, he suddenly collapsed into pieces, sacrificing all of his life force, even his soul, to become boundless scripture power, which then fused into his master, the sublime spirit Diyin. In that instant, the sublime spirit Diyin's flesh and blood once again grew strong, and his eyes began to blaze. He quickly returned to the peak state of his power. However, just as quickly, he began to wither again, as all of that chi and blood, all of his soul power and cultivation base, everything that was him, began to converge on his forehead. A popping sound then rang out as his forehead burst open, and a blood-colored spike flew out. Countless scriptural symbols swirled around that spike, which was none other than the sublime spirit scripture. That spike was made from bone, and was the combination of everything that the master and apprentice has sacrificed. All of that formed together into the sublime spirit spike. As soon as that spike appeared, the sublime spirit Diyin closed his eyes in death. As he died, his expression was calm, although touches of sadness and guilt could also be seen. Although the mountain and sea realm found no fault with him, nor did his apprentice, he felt regret for how he had treated that apprentice. If there is an afterlife. Rumble. The sublime spirit spike formed by the sublime spirit Diyin, and his apprentice then shot toward the eight essences paragon with indescribable speed. The female paragon's face flickered for the first time. Because of the chaos of the crumbling ceiling mark which surrounding her, she was inhibited, and the terrifying spike had her completely cornered. She simply couldn't escape. Apparently, sealing her was only one aspect of the trap which had been laid for her. The truly explosive part of the plan was to be carried out when the seal was broken. That plan was self-sacrifice. A massive boom echoed out as the spike drove its way into the eight essences paragon's chest, in the region of her heart. The vicious stabbing of the spike elicited a miserable shriek, which was the exact moment in which the Tao divinity Diyin opened his eyes. As the Tao divinity Diyin sighed, his apprentice behind him gave a carefree laugh. "Master, there is no need for you to feel regret. I'm a caretaker of the scripture, and have known all along how things would end. I have long since prepared myself. Master, you gave me my life, and the only regret I have is that I won't be able to care for you any longer. Master, let me take the first step." The apprentice exploded, transforming into countless scriptural symbols which shot toward his master, the Tao divinity Diyin. The Tao divinity Diyin's body instantly recovered. Sighing quietly, he nodded his head, and then without any hesitation, allowed his own body to wither as his chi and blood, his life force, his soul, his everything, converged on his forehead. Rumbling sounds echoed out as a spike suddenly flew out. It was the Tao divinity spike. The spike contained boundless divine sense as it shot forth, causing heaven and earth to shake violently. The sky faded and a wind screamed as it shot toward the eight essences paragon. She had first been pinned down by the effects of the ceiling mark shattering, and had been unable to avoid the sublime spirit spike. Now that the sublime spirit spike was stabbed into her, how could she possibly avoid the Tao divinity spike? A bang rang out as the spike stabbed into the paragon's forehead, directly into her brain. A blood-curdling scream rang out from her mouth, and a tremor ran through her. Her hair was in complete disarray as she fell back. She managed to break free of the ceiling mark, and then rotated her cultivation base like mad to try to push the two spikes out of her, two spikes which filled her with a sense of extreme danger. However, it was at this point that the completely withered heaven-severing Diyin suddenly opened his eyes. He was not dead. As he opened his eyes, there was something very different within them, as though he was no longer the heaven-severing Diyin, but rather someone else. He looked over at the fleeing eight essences paragon, and sighed. As he sighed, the withered youth behind him transformed into countless scriptural symbols, which then poured into the heaven-severing Diyin. The young man died without saying a single word. However, his eyes were filled with decisiveness and determination, and not the slightest bit of hesitation could be seen in his actions. As the heaven-severing Diyin absorbed those symbols, a sound like a sharp inhalation of breath could be heard. At the same time, the old man's aura suddenly grew even stranger than before. In fact, it seemed as if his cultivation base were rising, causing that strangeness in his aura to become more intense. I'm not actually the heaven-severing Diyin," he said softly, as if he were giving voice to his memories. An expression of sadness appeared on his face as he slowly turned his head to look first at the ninth mountain and sea, then at the forces of the Fang clan within the army, and finally, at Meng Hao. That glance was one which contained a reluctance to part, as well as profound sighing and sadness. And when he looked at Meng Hao, it contained love, as if he were looking at his own progeny. "Hey, you've grown up," he murmured. Meng Hao wasn't sure why, but when he saw the eyes of the heaven-severing Dian, he felt his heart trembling. He began to shake and even pant as a familiar sensation rose up sharply within him. He felt like lightning was striking at his mind. This person should have looked like a stranger, but as of this moment, as those eyes seemed to pierce into his memories, he remembered images from when he was a child. He remembered an old man holding him gently, and that man's eyes suddenly seemed exactly like these eyes. "Grandpa Fang," he cried out. As of this instant, everyone in the Fang clan was reacting to the heaven-severing Dian looking at them. Their faces flickered, filling with disbelief and shock as they looked back at him. Suddenly, the heaven-severing Dian's face began to change. Now, it looked very similar to Fang Ziyufeng's and also similar to Meng Hao's. His face seemed threatening without being angry. He was none other than Meng Hao's grandpa Fang, Fang Ziyufeng's father, the previous grand elder of the Fang clan, a man who excelled in both terms of latent talent and powers of understanding. His name was Fang Hehai, too. Fang Hehai was actually first mentioned in chapter 899. Years ago, he and Meng Hao's grandpa Meng had gone looking for an outsider to help save Meng Hao. That outsider had returned, but they never did. It wasn't until Meng Hao went to the 8th mountain and see that he found out that his grandpa Meng was the lord of the 8th mountain and sea. At that time, he had always wondered where his grandpa Fang was. His grandpa Meng had even told him that he wasn't in the realm. Meng Hao had previously speculated that perhaps his grandpa Fang had been hiding somewhere in the 33 heavens. But as of this moment, after seeing the face of the heaven-severing Dian, his mind reeled as he realized that this absolutely was the same man who existed in his memories, his grandpa Fang. But why did Grandpa Meng say that he wasn't in the realm? That was the question that immediately popped into his mind. It was in this moment that heaven-severing Dian, Fang Hehai, looked away. Filled with ferocious determination, he looked at the retreating 8 essences paragon, and then his forehead exploded. Heaven-severing, spike. / expand. The 3 Dian's true purpose had been to deal with an 8 essences paragon from the 33 heavens. They struck out, sealing that paragon, and yet that was only one part of their purpose. The true killing blow came in the form of the 3 spikes. Using the scriptural power within themselves, as well as the assistance of the custodians of the scriptures, their apprentices, they transformed into 3 scripture spikes. When those spikes stabbed into someone, that person's cultivation base would be sealed. Even an 8 essences expert who was struck by them would find their cultivation base severely dropped, if not for all eternity, then at least for a significantly long period of time. That person would drop from the 8 essences level to the 7 essences level, and perhaps even cease to be a paragon. Moments ago, the danger felt by the 8 essences paragon caused her to tremble. She had considered every angle to the situation, but had never imagined that the mountain and sea realm would be equipped in such a way. Nor could she ever have imagined that these Dians, who were comparable to imperial lords, would just sit and watch countless mountain and sea cultivators die, and would do nothing as the 1st through 7th mountains were destroyed. Such patience was terrifying, and left the 8 essences paragon completely shaken. And that was because she had no idea how many other tricks the mountain and sea realm was patiently waiting to reveal. It was even possible to say that the longer the mountain and sea realm kept fighting, the worse things were going for the 33 heavens, and the more likely that they might eventually lose. As the 8 essences paragon fell back, she looked at the heaven-severing Dian, and what drew her attention most was his aura. Previously, she had taken him to be dead, and could never have imagined that it had all been a trick. This is all a trap prepared for countless years to target an 8 essences paragon. This man is the heaven-severing Dian, and at the same time is not. The one who died before truly was a person who had cultivated the heaven-severing scripture to the point where he was on the very cusp of reaching the Dian level. But this man here is a discarnate soul who was placed into the body of the heaven-severing Dian by means of some grand magic. He is like a second life. Should the heaven-severing Dian actually die, then the discarnate soul would possess the body and thus still be able to wield the heaven-severing scripture. The 8 essences paragon's face fell as she realized all these things. However, It was at this point that the voice of heaven severing Dian Fang Hai's voice echoed out through the heavens. Heaven severing spike. His forehead exploded open in a mass of crimson blood as a spike burst out, filled with scriptural power that could end the heavens and crush the earth. It flew out with incredible speed, and at the same time, Fang Hai's body withered rapidly until his aura was completely gone. In the moment before his eyes shut, he looked over at his grandson, his most cherished descendant, the blood of his blood who made him more proud than anyone else. He had no desire to part ways, and his gaze was filled with both sadness and well wishes. Finally, he closed his eyes. Rumbling echoed out as the spike shot toward the Eight Essences Paragon with incredible speed. As for Meng Hao, he was trembling. That was his own grandfather, who had gone missing for years all because of him. "Grandpa," he murmured, tears welling up and spilling down his cheeks. Up to this point in the war, countless mountain and sea cultivators had felt the pain of watching friends and family die. Now it was Meng Hao's turn. "No!" Wails rose up from within the Fang clan. Eyes turned red as tears poured down their faces. According to the ancient saying, "Lead the people like your family." The Fang clan members couldn't help but think of that saying as they watched what was happening. Rumbling could be heard as the crimson heaven-severing spike bore down upon the Eight Essences Paragon. She already had 2 spikes stabbed into her, throwing her cultivation base into chaos. Therefore, she was incapable of evading the final spike as it stabbed into her dantian, causing a miserable scream to echo out from her mouth. However, at the same time, a look of determination flashed in her eyes. She had no time to ponder the matter in full. She was not a cultivator of the 33 heavens. She and the other 8 essences paragon had both come by means of possession. However, she was not a discarnate soul, she was a full and complete soul. She had stayed behind after the defeat of the paragon immortal realm, in order to stand guard within the 33 heavens. Her mission was to be prepared to make an early attack should the item sought by the 2 powers suddenly appear. If that happened, she was to wipe out the mountain and sea realm, and then wait to receive the 2 other powers. But now, those 2 powers were still on their way, and her cultivation base was suddenly suppressed. The battle was dragging on, and the resources at the disposal of the mountain and sea realm left her terrified. Having no other choice, she screamed 2 words at the top of her lungs. "Dao Feng." Even as the heaven-severing spike stabbed into her, she called the words out, almost as if she were uttering a curse. If you looked at her mouth, it would seem like numerous sounds were emerging, but what echoed in the ears of all that could hear were only 2 characters. "Dao Feng." In the moment that those 2 characters echoed out, backed by her curse-like delivery, at the very apex of the starry sky from whence the 33 heavens had descended, a sinister voice suddenly rang out to fill the entire mountain and sea realm, causing it and all of the heavens to shake. "I require a sacrifice from you." The heaven-severing spike stabbed all the way into the 8 essences paragon's dantian in the same moment that the voice echoed out. A tremor ran through her, and her cultivation base began to drop. Instantly, one of her essences was sealed, putting her at the 7 essences level. Even then, she continued to weaken, until she was only a hair away from dropping completely out of the paragon level. Her face was pale as she spit out a mouthful of her blood, causing some of her soul's longevity to fly out, lowering it by 60%. The sacrificed portion of her soul's longevity transformed into numerous threads, which shot up into the starry sky toward its very apex. Then, the 8 essences paragon began to laugh. "Mountain and sea realm, you are doomed to be destroyed." Suddenly, at the highest point in the starry sky, a deep golden light flooded out. If you looked closely, you would see that it was a staff. A gargantuan, shocking staff, which whistled down through the void toward the 8th mountain and sea. It was as if some unimaginably large giant were wielding that staff, causing the entire starry sky to tremble and shake. Massive rumbling sounds filled the entire 8th mountain and sea as they shook violently and began to crumble. Finally, they exploded. One strike of a staff destroyed an entire mountain and sea. Said a sinister voice, which sounded somewhat surprised. "How come the mountains and seas seem so much weaker?" When the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm heard the voice, they were completely shaken and looked up into the starry sky to see an enormous figure approaching the mountain and sea realm. He held a staff over his shoulder, and as his features became clear, he was revealed to be a humanoid monkey. His raging, murderous aura caused the starry sky to be thrown into chaos. A vortex of stars seemed to form around him, causing shocking energy to radiate out. A single strike from his staff shattered the entire 8th mountain and sea, and left the mountain and sea cultivators completely shaken. There were even some who began to cry out in despair. Meng Hao's mind was spinning as he stared at the monkey, who was none other than Dao Fang. He stood guard outside of the 33 heavens, maintaining the last barrier imprisoning the mountain and sea realm. After the summons and sacrifice of the 8 essences paragon, he was able to descend in person. Heaven and earth trembled, and the starry sky shook. It now seemed as if the mountains and seas could be completely wiped out at any moment. However, it was at this point that a voice suddenly rang out from within the 9th mountain and sea. It came from a spot in the void of the starry sky where, all of a sudden, 2 people appeared. One was Shui Dongliu, and the other was the second 8 essences paragon from the 33 heavens. It was the middle-aged man who didn't seem to be an outsider at all. As soon as he appeared, blood oozed out of the corners of his mouth, and his face was deathly pale as he fell into retreat, staring at Shui Dongliu the entire time. His expression was one of agitation, fear, and even disbelief. "Nine Seals, it's you. I can't believe you're still alive." Even as the man fell back, a thunderous voice spread out in all directions, which belonged to none other than Shui Dongliu. "Mountain and sea realm cultivators, return to the 9th mountain and sea. Prepare for the final battle." His voice seemed to carry a strange power, and as soon as the mountain and sea realm cultivators heard it, they instantly trusted it. Without hesitation, they began to fall back, even Paragon Sea Dream and the other powerful experts. As the mountain and sea realms forces began to retreat to the 9th mountain and sea, the 8 essences female paragon seemed inclined to stop them, but was unable. As for the 8 essences male paragon, his eyes flashed, but fear lingered in his heart, and he did nothing to interfere. However, the newly arrived Dao Fang's lips twisted into a cold smile. The staff which he carried slung over his shoulders suddenly flashed out toward the cultivators who were retreating into the 9th mountain and sea. The staff was a deep gold color, and moved with incredible quickness. As it bore down on the 9th mountain, it grew longer and longer, until it was on the very brink of smashing down onto its target. It was at this point that a cold snort echoed out, and Shui Dongliu took a step forward to appear atop the 9th mountain. He extended his hand and waved his sleeve, causing rumbling sounds to fill the air. The 9th mountain trembled as a boundless power flowed out from Shui Dongliu's sleeve, slamming into the staff. BO1 It was as if the staff had been blocked by some powerful force. It was incapable of moving any further down and was in fact sent rebounding back. Dao Fang's pupils constricted as the staff vibrated in his right hand. Shui Dongliu had used only his own strength to block that staff, and although his face was a bit flushed, he seemed none the worse for the wear. The truth was that his chi and blood were churning, and his soul was unstable, and yet his eyes were calm as he sighed inwardly. "I'm finally getting old," he thought. After his attack was repelled, Dao Fang did not make another move. He glanced coldly at the mountain and sea cultivators in their retreat, then looked back at the 9th mountain, which was now the final stronghold for the forces of the mountain and sea realm. As of this moment, all that remained were the 9th sea and the 9th mountain. Chapter 1383, The Staff of Dao Fang. Chapter 1384, Driving a Wedge. The mountain and sea realm was quiet. All of the surviving cultivators were gathered in the 9th mountain. There were only a few million, but those few million had survived a brutal war and were the elite among the elite. Every one of them, regardless of the level of their cultivation bases, lived now after having braved endless carnage. These were no longer amateurs when it came to battle. They had gained spirit and hope, and yet all of that seemed to be wavering now. How could they win? How could they even fight? Outside of the 9th mountain and sea was an army of outsiders tens of millions strong, who had the mountain and sea realm completely surrounded. Further off in the distance were the 18th through 33rd heavens, like enormous beasts that struck fear into the hearts of those who beheld them. Most salient of all was the fact that leading this army of outsiders were not just 2 8 essences paragons. With the addition of the monkey Dao Fang, they now had 3 8 essences paragons. For all intents and purposes, the moment such a force had been revealed, the mountain and sea realm was already defeated. The world was lost, and the people were on the verge of being broken. The silent pressure weighing down on the 9th mountain and sea made it seem like a dormant volcano. No one spoke. Millions of cultivators looked silently at the scene surrounding them. Virtually all of them were recovering from the wounds that riddled their bodies. Did hope even exist anymore? That unanswerable question continued to fester in the minds and hearts of everyone. The war had turned truly bitter when the first mountain and sea was destroyed, and after that, one mountain and sea after another crumbled until now, all that was left was the ninth mountain and sea. Meng Hao looked out at that very mountain and sea, and his heart hurt as he realized that what he was looking at really was his home. But as the war raged on, death became unavoidable. Family and friends alike were about to become nothing more than dust. At some point, Su Qing emerged from the crowd to stand at Meng Hao's side. When he saw her, he reached out and clasped her hand. It felt cold. As she gazed calmly into Meng Hao's eyes, it seemed as if the mere act of holding his hand was the most important thing in the world. The members of the Fang clan also made their way to stand by Meng Hao's side. His family came. His friends came. In this moment when all that remained of the mountain and sea realm was the ninth mountain and sea, for many people, Meng Hao was the standard-bearer of them all. Further off in the distance, Patriarch Reliance sighed, carrying the state of Zhao with him as he also drew close. Also there in the ninth mountain and sea were the Li clan and the Wang clan, cold and desolate, just like all of the other various sects and clans present. Meng Hao could sense his sister's aura on planet South Heaven. She was with his parents. As the mountain and sea realm stood there in its silence, Paragon Sea Dream's voice suddenly echoed out. Looking up at Shui Dongliu and doing nothing to prevent anyone from hearing her, she said, "You're really 9 seals." When the mountain and sea cultivators heard her words, they also looked up into the sky. Even though not everyone could see what was up above, the bleakness in their hearts suddenly faded, and gradually hope began to burn again. They had all heard of Paragon 9 Seals, and throughout the events of the war, they had become more convinced than ever that he was a magnificent, glorious individual. To hear his name now suddenly filled them with deep anticipation. Meng Hao looked up at Shui Dongliu, waiting like everyone else to hear his answer. Shui Dongliu didn't say anything at first, but then, after a moment had passed, he nodded his head and said, "Yes, I am 9 Seals." The instant he spoke those words, all of the cultivators of the ninth mountain and sea were stirred into excitement. It was as if they had been resurrected from the dead, as if they once again had hope. 9 Seals was a legend in the mountain and sea realm, the paragon who had actually created the entire realm. In fact, he could rightly be called the ultimate patriarch of every cultivator of the mountain and sea realm. Although everyone was excited, there were some people who reacted differently, including Meng Hao, Kesidigarbha, Sea Dream, the mountain and sea lords, and select other individuals who were especially wise and perceptive. "He's actually not 9 Seals," Meng Hao thought, sighing inwardly. He didn't speak the words aloud, but because of the paragon's blood inside of him, he knew that Shui Dongliu was definitely not Paragon 9 Seals. There was something odd about how Sea Dream had worded her statement, as if her purpose in asking it was to get him to agree with her, and thus stir the passions of the mountain and sea cultivators. If he went along with Sea Dream's words, it would prove that he really was 9 Seals. If he denied her words to be truth, then the possibility still existed that he might actually be 9 Seals. Meng Hao understood that, as did some of the others, although no one pointed it out aloud. Numerous sea denizens who floated on the surface of the ninth sea first looked out at the scene beyond the mountain and sea realm, then turned to look silently toward the ninth mountain. The entire ninth sea was currently blanketed by its will. Even as Shui Dongliu's words stirred the hearts of the mountain and sea realm cultivators, the voice of the 8 Essences male cultivator rang out from within the ranks of the outsider army. "Immortals of the mountains and seas, you have lost this war. There is no need to continue the fighting. I can represent the 33 heavens to offer you a chance at survival. Surrender, abandon all resistance, willingly allow us to seal your cultivation bases and become our slaves. This war is over. If you surrender, some of you may be executed, but the majority will survive. Some sects and clans may be allowed to continue to exist. You might have no freedom, but perhaps that in itself is a sort of luxury. In any case, you have no other options. Fight or surrender. I will give you the time it takes an incense stick to burn to think. For those of you who wish to surrender, you do not need to state that desire out loud. Doing that might get you killed on the spot. After the time it takes an incense stick to burn, the 33 heavens will begin the final charge. Fellow Taoist Xuan Yin, fellow Taoist Dao Fang, and myself will also join in to attack the mountain and sea realm full force. During the fighting, any who wish to surrender can simply switch sides and fight the mountain and sea realm. We will accept that as your form of surrender." Eyes glittering, the 8 Essences paragon waved his hand, causing a stick of burning incense to appear. What savagely malicious tactics! By offering such hope to the mountain and sea realm cultivators, he also sowed discord among them. When it came time to fight, the cultivators would have to worry, not just about the outsiders attacking openly, but about their fellow comrades in arms. No one could say for sure what choice people might make in a moment of mortal peril. Meng Hao's pupils constricted as he realized that, even among the Fang clan, there were people who appeared to be hesitating in contemplation. Although such expressions quickly vanished, it was impossible to tell whether their temptation had been dispelled or merely concealed. The mountain and sea realm was deathly quiet. The cultivators couldn't help but ponder the words of the Eight Essences paragon. It was a critical juncture, and with the threat of death looming overhead, the idea of becoming a slave, despite being repugnant, was a way to stay alive. See Dream said nothing. Shui Dongliu didn't say a word. The ninth sea was completely silent. The incense stick burned, and time passed. The silence became pressure weighing down on everyone. If Shui Dongliu hadn't just stated that he was 9 seals, then the mountain and sea realm would likely have already dissolved into chaos. When faced with life or death, one's choices can easily become irrational. However, even Shui Dongliu claiming the identity of 9 seals did not have a huge impact. After all, the overall situation seemed to be a completely hopeless one. It was at this point that Shui Dongliu spoke, his voice both ancient and exhausted. Life and death are important things to everyone. Ensuring that one's traditions and values can be passed on to future generations is something important to all sects and clans. To me, being able to pass on the Joss flame power and the bloodlines of the mountain and sea realm is also very important. Therefore, considering we have fought this war down to this point, any individual, any clan or sect who wishes to surrender to the 33 heavens may do so without my interference. I won't kill you. It is your decision to make. Make your decision now and I won't question it. Everyone has their own fate and I dare not interfere with that. However, once this moment passes and the fighting begins, anyone who turns traitor on the battlefield can rest assured that even if I die, I will be sure to take those traitors with me into death, along with the mountain and sea realm. Therefore, those of you who wish to surrender will leave the mountain and sea realm post-haste. Shui Dongliu's voice contained no viciousness, but instead, an unswerving decisiveness that everyone could detect. Silence filled the mountain and sea realm. The army of outsiders looked contemptuously at the cultivators, as though the current turn of events were splendid entertainment. Then just when the incense stick was about to finish burning, a sigh rang out from the ninth mountain and sea from within, one of the great clans, the Wang clan. I speak for the Wang clan, we choose to surrender. The earliest ancestor of the Wang clan was not from the mountain and sea realm, and only ended up here by accident. Therefore, this war of the mountains and seas is something we shall not participate in. The words spoken by the Wang clan patriarch caused most of the Wang clan cultivators to sigh in relief. However, a few of their number were clearly furious. One of them was Wang Mu, who tried to charge out from the ranks of the Wang clan. Before he could, an ancient-looking hand reached out and grabbed him. No, Wang Mu's eyes were completely bloodshot as he screamed in defiance. However, the old man behind him sighed, then rendered him unconscious with a palm strike. In that same moment, a beam of light shot up from within the Wang clan, as a tall, elegant young man appeared. It was none other than Wang Tengfei. Although he had his grievances with Meng Hao in this moment when the survival of the realm was on the line, his choice was to stand with the mountains and seas. However, the Wang clan would not permit it, and he was prevented from leaving. At the same time that the Wang clan chose to surrender, the skinny old man in the Wang clan's bamboo forest sighed. How embarrassing, he muttered. Shaking his head, he closed his eyes. He would not fight in the battle, but he wanted to see if the mountain and sea realm might be able to make a comeback. After a moment of silence, a bitter voice spoke out from the ranks of another of the great clans, the Li clan. I speak for the Li clan. We surrender. When that voice echoed out, Li Linger, who was currently standing next to Paragon Sea Dream, began to tremble. Tears flowed down her as she cried, Patriarch W. What are you doing? We are cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. I can't believe I'm even related to you. Note from Deathblade. Fellow Taoists, at this late stage in the novel, the theme of you can't trust what characters say has been pretty well established. Don't we all remember the Meng Li/Resurrection Lily incident? Don't be so quick to just believe what you hear the characters say. I continue to see comments which quote or reference character dialogue as though it were a definitive explanation of cultivation ranks, plot points, history, etc. Just as in real life. The characters in Gen's novels can be wrong, can lie, can make mistakes, etc. Chapter 1385. Life or Death for the People of the Mountains and Seas. However, no one responded to Li Linger. Instead, more declarations of surrender began to ring out in the starry sky. I speak for the Heavenly Tao sect. I speak for the Sen clan. In the moments before the incense stick finished burning, one voice after another spoke out within the Ninth Mountain and Sea. With the exception of the sects from the Ninth Mountain itself, and some of the staunchest sects from the other mountains and seas, everyone seemed to be choosing to surrender. Every voice that spoke caused Meng Hao to sink further into silence until, suddenly a calm voice rang out, ancient and womanly. As soon as Meng Hao heard that voice, he looked up. I am the will of the Ninth Sea, and I choose to leave the mountain and sea realm. I choose to surrender. In total, 7 sects and 11 clans chose to surrender, as well as hundreds of thousands of individual cultivators. The final number of cultivators exceeded 1,000,000. The moment that those clans and sects chose to surrender, their only option was to follow the command of Shui Dongliu and leave the mountain and sea realm. Staying behind was not a possibility. They were betrayers, and the mountain and sea realm would not tolerate their presence in the final battle. Gradually, they began to make their way out of the Ninth Mountain, taking their resources and their experts with them. They did not delay or move slowly. They left as quickly as was possible. The vast number of people involved left the power of the mountain and sea realm reduced by nearly 30%. The sight of so many cultivators taking flight caused those who remained behind to tremble inwardly. They had assumed that only a small number of people who would actually surrender. Who could have imagined that so many would give in? After all, even one person surrendering would be a serious blow to the morale of the mountain and sea realm as a whole, especially considering that the final battle was about to be fought. Even the outsiders had never expected so many people to surrender. When they saw what was happening, contemptuous looks appeared on their faces, and some of them even began to laugh. A wide smile could be seen on the face of the 8 Essences male paragon. The main reason he had attempted to drive a wedge into the forces of the mountain and sea realm was because of his fear of Shui Dongliu. Although the outsider army seemed to have the upper hand, deep in his heart he wasn't completely confident, so he wanted to reduce their power somehow. And then the will of the Ninth Sea spoke out, causing the mountain and sea realm cultivators' minds to reel. The Ninth Sea was a part of the mountain and sea realm, so for it to surrender. The meaning behind such an act was profound, and many people didn't dare to even contemplate it. That was because the Ninth Sea declaring surrender indicated that the will of the mountain and sea realm as a whole had been so weakened by the destruction of the other mountains and seas that it was unable to maintain control over the Ninth Sea. If you liken the will of the mountain and sea realm to the commander-in-chief, then the 9 mountains and 9 seas were like generals. Now, 16 of those generals were dead, and the commander-in-chief was so weak that of his remaining 2 generals, one of them chose to turn traitor. Apparently, not even Shui Dongliu had considered this would happen. An intense light began to shine in his eyes as his gaze came to rest upon the Ninth Sea, and then he sighed. Meng Hao trembled as he stared at the Ninth Sea, at the waves lapping across its surface, and the heads of the various sea denizens sticking up out of the water. As the Ninth Sea slowly began to move off, Meng Hao suddenly shouted in a voice like thunder, "Is this because of me?" It was a question that perhaps should not have been asked, and yet he couldn't hold back from doing so. After a long moment of silence, the will of the Ninth Sea spoke back. "You've grown to the point that I regret being so stubborn back then, but even if you didn't exist, I would still make this choice. I am the first and only sea in the entire realm to achieve self-awareness. If the mountain and sea realm itself were not faced with such difficulties, then I could bow my head to its authority. But now, the realm is about to disappear, and I don't want to be buried along with it." With that, the Ninth Sea flowed away from the Ninth Mountain like a retreating tide until the 2 of them were completely separated. As traders left, the mountain and sea realm cultivators who had chosen not to surrender felt as though their hearts were being stabbed by knives. By this point, their morale had reached rock bottom. And then the incense stick stopped burning. However, the final battle didn't begin immediately. The sects and clans who had surrendered, as well as the random cultivators, flew out in various directions, keeping their distance from each other. As they dispersed, the Eight Essences male paragon hesitated for a moment before making the call for the final battle. The surrender of the Ninth Sea was something he took very seriously. It was with icy eyes that he examined the remaining cultivators of the mountain and sea and saw how dejected they looked. It was in that exact same moment that someone in the mountain and sea realm shouted out in rage that the traitors should be chased down and killed. Some people even began to demand of Sea Dream, Shui Dongliu, and Meng Hao that they be allowed to do so. Sea Dream and Meng Hao maintained bitter silence, but Shui Dongliu waved his sleeve. If they want to go, let them go. From now on, they have nothing to do with the mountain and sea realm. Although his voice seemed calm, the Eight Essences male paragon could detect the pain and disappointment therein. Then he began to laugh. Time passed as all of the cultivators who had chosen to surrender left the mountain and sea realm and neared the outsider army. Finally, the Eight Essences paragon waved his hand. Let the final battle begin. Are you mmmmblllly? Instantly, the outsider army which surrounded the Ninth Mountain roared, and then charged toward it, bursting with killing intent and ferocity. Soon, the front lines of the outsider army crossed paths with the surrendering mountain and sea cultivators, who were trembling. Mixed feelings could be seen on their faces. After all, the mountain and sea realm had once been their home. However, even as the outsider army swept past the surrendering mountain and sea cultivators, a lone rogue cultivator threw his head back and laughed. My name is Zhao Tianliang. Live for the mountains and seas, die for the mountains and seas. Without the slightest hesitation, he self-detonated. However, the sound of the explosion was insignificant compared to the army at large, and his final shout before death was similarly minuscule. But after that, more self-detonations occurred. Within the army of outsiders that surrounded the Ninth Mountain, 1,000 self-detonations erupted, then 10,000, then 100,000. With each self-detonation, a voice cried out, defiant, begrieved, and maddened. My name is Sun Yaohai. Live for the mountains and seas, die for the mountains and seas. My name is Chang Ye. Live for the mountains and seas, die for the mountains and seas. Rumbling echoed out that could shake heaven and earth. Self-detonations occurred that could strike fear into the hearts of celestial beings. Tens of thousands of explosions transformed into a mighty, destructive power. At one point, an entire sect chose to unleash all of their madness by means of self-detonation. My name is Zhou Sheng. Fellow Taoists of the mountains and seas, if any of you manage to stay alive, commemorate this sacrifice that I make this day. My name is Liu Wenyu. If anyone survives this war, please, avenge my death. Massive rumbling sounds echoed out as the entire sect self-detonated. The madness of the mountain and sea cultivators left the outsiders completely shaken. As for the cultivators who stood on the Ninth Mountain, their hearts were trembling. It wasn't just sects who made such a choice. Next, an entire clan suddenly scattered in all directions and then self-detonated, regardless of the level of their cultivation bases. As they exploded, they called out their names, and although they were loath to part with the mountains and seas, their rage toward the outsiders caused the power of their sacrifice to shake the starry sky. On this day, our heavenly Tao sect destroys our Tao. Mountain and sea cultivators, remember what we have done this day. Our Sen clan started this war 1,000,000 strong, and now only 9,000 remain. Our clan has been almost completely wiped out. Now all 9,000 of us self-detonate. Our bloodline will be wiped away, and yet we hesitate not. Mountain and sea cultivators, avenge our deaths. The Li clan are the descendants of Lord Li. Perhaps we are not cultivators of the mountain and sea realm, and perhaps we shouldn't even be here. But this is our home today. We willingly destroy our Tao. Young Linger, you had no need to curse me, your patriarch. Massive booms echoed out. This shocking turn of events threw the entire outsider army into utter chaos. Even the Eight Essences male paragon's face fell. He could never have imagined that this would happen. At the same time, the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were trembling, and their morale erupted from the depths of despair. The desperate and bitter voices which echoed out caused the blood of all the cultivators of the mountains and seas to boil. Their eyes were crimson as they began to roar with madness. The words of her patriarch echoed in Li Linger's ears, and she shook as she watched her own Li clan dying. As of this moment, even more self-detonations were occurring. Our Wintergate sect shall destroy our Tao. Let heaven and earth bear witness. Let the starry sky testify that the blood of our sect shall curse the 33 heavens to die a horrible death. How could the Klersky Society possibly betray the mountains and seas? Die. I Dao Yunlai am a cultivator of the mountains and seas. Remember my name, you villainous outsiders." Booms rang out as the self-detonations went on without end. From a distance, the glow of explosions lit up the starry sky of the ninth mountain like countless blooming flowers. The only difference was that those flowers were flowers of blood. Meng Hao was trembling. As of this moment, he could sense that this was all part of Shui Dongliu's plan. It had been obvious to him from the moment Shui Dongliu had mentioned allowing everyone to leave. Even still, he couldn't help but be moved. All of a sudden, he remembered something he had heard long ago, and now the true meaning occurred to him. After the heavens were changed, the world tree refused to surrender, and instead destroyed itself in the starry sky. 1. The world tree destroying itself was mentioned several times throughout the story. When I went back to check some of the earlier chapters, I realized that my translation was a bit off in some of those parts. I've since cleaned up those passages. The most relevant and early references to the world tree are in chapters 109 and 158. Later chapters essentially say the same thing as those early chapters. It was a Tao. It was the culmination of all types of natural and magical laws. Perhaps it was the true Tao, the final evolution which transformed into something that was both illusory and yet truly existed, the Tao. Suddenly, Shui Dongliu called out, "Mountain and sea realm cultivators, if we don't fight now, then when will we?" Chapter 1386, Fighting Will Cleaves Heaven and Earth. Shui Dongliu's words seemed to cleave heaven and earth, to open up a massive door. The cultivators of the mountain and sea realm, with all their pent-up madness caused by everything that was happening, now burst out in a murderous charge. The final battle had begun. The battle, and in fact the war, had already been lost by the mountain and sea realm. However, despite losing, they still had their dignity. Even if they died, they would make the enemy feel pain, a pain that would last for a lifetime and make it impossible to forget the dignity and spirit of the mountain and sea realm, and how terrifying it was. The self-detonations continued. However, not all of the defectors were secretly loyal. Some of them really were betraying the mountain and sea realm. However, because of the chaos unleashed by the double dealing, even the traitors were fell upon by the outsiders. The Ninth Sea, who truly had turned traitor, was not affected. Neither was the Wang clan. Just when it seemed they were about to be overwhelmed, a beam of sword light descended, separating them from the army. That was the handiwork of the Eight Essences' male paragon. Even as he grimly and furiously watched events play out, he took time to protect the Wang clan. As for all of the true traitors, after being attacked by the surrounding outsider army, none of them chose to self-detonate, and yet, they didn't prolong their lives much longer than those who did. The scene outside of the ninth mountain was one of utter chaos. Even as the voices continued to ring out, followed by the booms of self-detonation, the rest of the mountain and sea cultivators charged out into battle. Their eyes were completely bloodshot, and they had long since reached a state which was impossible to describe in terms of morale. According to an old saying, an army burning with indignation is bound to win. However, the mountain and sea cultivators were not simply burning with indignation. They were burning with madness and insanity. To them, the whole world was blood, and anything that was not that same bloody color would be savaged by them until they were. These cultivators had no fear of death, and given the chance, they would self-detonate in the moment before dying. They did so with no hesitation or shying back, and their shouts struck fear into the hearts of the outsiders. "I killed one of these fools, but that's not enough. Ha ha ha, I killed 5 outsiders, that's good enough for me, I can die happy. Father will be reunited soon. I used to be afraid of dying, but now I realize that there is nothing to fear in death. Bring it on, you damned outsiders, bring it on." Die! Roars echoed out, and explosions rocked heaven and earth. The cultivators of the mountain and sea realm had gone mad. There were millions of them going up against tens of millions of outsiders, and yet, it was the outsiders who were being pushed back. All of the outsiders' scorn, mockery, and cruelty vanished, to be replaced by shock, confusion, and astonishment. They were completely shaken by the madness of the mountain and sea realm cultivators, and in fact couldn't understand this level of dedication. The mercilessness and bloodthirsty way that the mountain and sea realm cultivators fought left them flabbergasted. It was almost as if the tide of battle had completely shifted in the opposite direction. Every single cultivator of the mountain and sea realm joined in the fight, only the mortals did not. Among that fighting force was Ki Jiusi, Meng Hao's master pill demon, Sun Hai, Tiangzai, the echelon cultivators, and other familiar faces. There was Chen Fan, Wang Yaokai Fatty, Li Ling or Jai Yin, the patriarchs of the Fang clan, and also Fang Wei, and even more. By this point in the war, there was no need for troop formations or complicated strategies. Su Qing gritted her teeth, left Meng Hao's side, and began to slaughter her way into the army of outsiders. War was not the time to ruminate over matters like love and romance. Meng Hao was also there. The three outsider paragons, as well as all of their imperial lords, were battling their way onto the ninth mountain. Shui Dongliu was fighting, as was the paragon puppet, Kei Siddhigarbha, the mountain and sea lords, and paragon Sea Dream, who was burning her own life force. In addition to all that were the various chosen who had acquired good fortune in the 33 hells, they were the ones holding off the imperial lords, while Shui Dongliu single-handedly took on Dao Fang. That particular battle caused the entire ninth mountain to shake and eventually start to show signs of crumbling. Sea Dream, the paragon puppet, and Kei Siddhigarbha were running on fumes as they pinned down the 8 essences male paragon. As for Meng Hao, he brimmed with infinite killing intent as he fought the person who had brought about the death of his grandpa Fang, the female paragon with the weakened cultivation base. Fight! Heaven and earth wept, and the starry sky wept tears of blood. On the various planets, the mortals more or less understood that some shocking event was occurring beyond the sky. After all, it had been some time since they had glimpsed either the sun or the moon. From up above, countless dots of light could be seen, which were lanterns the mortals were using to light the endless night as they prostrated themselves to the heavens and offered up prayers. From the beggars to the emperors, everyone was doing the exact same thing. This was a war of complete genocide. If the mountains and seas were defeated, it wouldn't just be the cultivators who died. The mortal world would also cease to exist. Not even the outsider paragons could ever have predicted that the final battle would be so brutal, and yet, that was exactly how things were playing out. The cultivator with the unusually large head sped across the ninth mountain, causing headaches for the powerful experts of the mountains and seas wherever he went. Although his cultivation base seemed comparable to the people he was tangling with, he rarely spent time in open fighting. The overall situation was only getting worse for the mountain and sea realm. On all fronts, it was essentially the same. Although Meng Hao was able to force the female paragon back across the battlefield, he couldn't kill her. Furthermore, the interference from the large-headed cultivator was only causing his murderous aura to burn hotter. Everyone was struggling to hold the line, however. It wouldn't be long before a breach was opened, and the outsiders burst in like a flood. The armies clashed, and the millions upon millions of outsiders were relentlessly pushed back. However, there were simply too many of them. The berserk fighting state of the mountain and sea cultivators could only last for so long. As the self-detonations continued, and as the cultivators grew wearier, casualties mounted on both sides. Over and over again, cries rang out across the battlefield of, "Live for the mountains and seas, die for the mountains and seas." It was the battle cry of the mountains and seas, and apparently as long as those words could be heard echoing out, the mountains and seas would not fall. The moment the words ceased to be heard, it would mean the mountain and sea cultivators were all dead. On one part of the battlefield that Meng Hao couldn't see was Tiangzai. Soaked in blood and screaming savagely, he was not just fighting, he was unleashing complete savagery. However, in his madness, he was losing strength. His magical techniques were exhausted, his divine abilities spent, his magical items used up. And yet, he lunged forward and savagely buried his teeth into the neck of an outsider. That outsider had a higher cultivation base than him, but in its shock, it could do nothing more than let out a blood-curdling scream. Tiangzai ripped at the outsider's throat with his teeth, ignoring the violent blows of other enemies blasting into him as he did so. Mad ruthlessness gleamed in his eyes, which were completely devoid of any regret. In the end, when he began to lose consciousness because of the unceasing attacks of the surrounding outsiders, he suddenly smiled. "Live for the mountains and seas, die for the mountains and seas. I am Tiangzai." A boom rang out as he self-detonated. Although the power of the explosion wasn't enormous, he didn't hesitate for a moment in his decision. The outsider whose throat he had been slashing at was ripped to shreds by the explosion. The other surrounding outsiders managed to avoid death, but were seriously injured. Moments later, an enraged wave of mountain and sea cultivators surged in to take advantage of the situation. The outsiders' fear was visible in their eyes. From their perspective, these mountain and sea cultivators were not immortals. They were a race even more savage than that. On another part of the battlefield, where the three great Taoist societies were making their stand, Fandonger was there, her hair in disarray as she fought. She no longer looked anything at all like a divine daughter. She seemed out of her mind as she fought with complete and utter ruthlessness. She had been a proud person, the divine daughter of the Nine Seas god world. But then came the defection of the Ninth Sea, which was a huge blow to the god world from the Ninth Sea. Fandonger couldn't wrap her mind around it. The Ninth Sea was her home. The Ninth Sea hadn't just taken away the sea beasts which resided in it. Many of the Nine Seas god world disciples had left with it, even some of the patriarchs. Their departure had caused the glory and splendor of the Nine Seas god world to fade into nothing. Fandonger didn't leave with them. She stayed with some of the other senior members of the sect and the rest of the disciples to slaughter their way into the outsider army. She was exhausted and was soaked in both her own blood and the blood of the enemy. Her once beautiful face had been slashed by a magical blade, opening up a grisly wound that made her look even more ferocious. Normally speaking, she wouldn't have been able to last this long in the fight. However, a corpse floated behind her, whose hair flew out to defend her constantly. Fandonger laughed bitterly as she continued to fight. And yet, her exhaustion only increased. She cut down one more outsider, and that outsider's dying counterattack shattered most of her heart's blood vessels. "Am I going to die now?" she thought, coughing up a mouthful of blood. As she began to lose consciousness, she looked toward the ninth mountain and just barely managed to catch sight of Meng Hao. "Goodbye," she said. Sighing, she was just about to self-detonate when the white-robed corpse behind her suddenly looked down at her with a benevolent expression. Sighing, the corpse's hair suddenly flew out, wrapping Fandonger up in a cocoon which sank down into the starry sky. If there was a bottom to the starry sky down below, then that is where they went. No one else on the chaotic battlefield took note of their departure. Further off in the distance was a middle-aged cultivator, who threw his head back and laughed maniacally. He was covered in so many wounds it seemed impossible that he could still be alive. Numerous flying swords were stabbed into him from all angles, and he was completely soaked in blood. Despite all that, he looked as ferocious as ever as he slaughtered his way into the outsider army, laughing the entire time. "I am Song Liuoden, you bastards, Dao child of the Song clan. I defeated Meng Hao once before. Why don't you outsider scumbags do me a favor and just die?" Song Liuoden was now in the ancient realm, but he fought with such brutality and power that the surrounding outsiders were completely terrified and tried to avoid him at all costs. As he slaughtered his way through the battlefield, outsider corpses began to pile up around him. Eventually, his energy weakened and his aura disappeared. He came to a stop, surrounded by a multitude of corpses. He looked almost like he was simply resting there silently for a moment, silent. However, after a bit of time passed, the shocked outsiders began to edge closer. At that point, one of the outsider elders sighed with mixed emotions and murmured, "He's finally dead." /expand. The mountain and sea cultivators fought on, along with Sea Dream and the Paragon puppet. Sea Dream hadn't accomplished much in the fighting so far. Her cultivation base had long since been in a state of atrophy, and it was only with the support of the Paragon puppet that she managed to continue fighting without suffering defeat. As for Shui Dongliu, his attacks caused the starry sky to tremble as fantastic lights flashed about, accompanied by roaring booms. Meng Hao's eyes abounded with killing intent as he fought the 8 Essences female paragon. Because of the 3 scripture spikes, her cultivation base had dropped to the level of an imperial lord, and even seemed to be slipping toward that of a Dao sovereign. Meng Hao attacked without mercy. His paragon bridge descended, the crushing power of which left the female paragon coughing up blood. She tried to flee, but then he unleashed his demon-sealing hexing magic. The essence of space began to form as he tried to seal her, but it was in that exact moment that the large-headed cultivator suddenly appeared and unleashed a bizarre magical technique. Booms rang out, and the blood drained from Meng Hao's face as his essence of space was suddenly interrupted. The shocked female paragon coughed up blood. Moments before, she had felt the shadow of death looming over her. That didn't cause Meng Hao to pause, though. Even as he fell back, he unleashed the 4th hex, the self-hex, causing a multitude of clones to appear, all of which charged toward the female paragon in shocking fashion. The paragon's scalp went numb as she retreated in the face of countless Meng Hao clones, all unleashing the god-slaying fist. The convergence of so many god-slaying fists caused the starry sky to tremble and filled the entire area with a towering murderous aura. "No," she screamed. Unwilling to be defeated, she bit the tip of her tongue and spit out some blood, unleashing a secret magic that instantly caused her to grow blurry. At the same time, she produced a vast quantity of different magical items, holding nothing back as she then used even more secret magics to avoid the deadly fist strikes. It was in that exact same moment that the large-headed cultivator popped up yet again. Simultaneously, Meng Hao suddenly performed an incantation gesture with his left hand and jabbed it toward the man. "I've been waiting for you to show up," he said. Hexing magic was unleashed, and yet a strange gleam appeared in the eyes of the large-headed cultivator. Even as the power of Meng Hao's hexing magic closed in, he suddenly split into two. One version ended up trapped by the fetters of the hex, whereas the other took a step to appear by the side of the female paragon. Then, his body began to wriggle and shrink, except for his right hand, which grew larger as it apparently converged all of the power of his flesh and blood. Even as his body became completely out of proportion, a vicious expression could be seen on his face as he threw his own fist out to meet the god-slaying fist. Boom! Blood sprayed out of Meng Hao's mouth, but the same thing happened to the large-headed cultivator, who simultaneously dragged the female paragon away. Despite having been rescued, she was also coughing up blood, and the seriousness of the injuries caused her to stare hatefully at Meng Hao. "You really remind me of my old master," said the large-headed cultivator, staring at Meng Hao with a serious expression as he wiped the blood from his mouth. 1. All evidence points to the fact that this large-headed cultivator is a character from Renegade Immortal, who was also referred to as large-headed in that novel, and was a follower of Wang Lin. He hasn't appeared in the translated chapters as of this release, so if you follow that novel, you can be on the lookout for him in the future. The female paragon was currently not a match for Meng Hao, but because of the interference of the large-headed cultivator, Meng Hao was incapable of killing her. Killing intent flickered in Meng Hao's eyes as he leapt back into the fight with the two of them. As they fought, the dazzling shine of magical techniques spread out in all directions. The fighting going on elsewhere was just as bitter. That was especially the case with Sea Dream, whose face was completely ashen as she tenaciously refused to stop fighting. The current battle involved the absolute peak fighters among both the 33 heavens and the mountain and sea realm. The starry sky twisted and distorted. Few words were exchanged. Everyone knew that in this battle, one side would be wiped out, or the other would. Originally, fighting like this should have been glorious and dazzling within the starry sky. However, the mountain and sea realm cultivators were fighting with their last blaze of glory, causing the starry sky to darken and fade. In this moment, the true glory belonged Song Liuoden and the other cultivators like him. Then there were the cultivators who chose to self-detonate. They called out their names before becoming like bright stars shining out, casting light out once more into the starry sky. However, that light didn't last long. More and more cultivators of the mountain and sea realm fell in battle, and soon the outsiders were able to bypass them and start advancing upon the ninth mountain itself. In turn, mountain and sea cultivators fell back to try to stop them. The battleground was gradually shifting from being outside of the ninth mountain to within its very borders. The outsiders had finally made it to the last of the mountains. The starry sky was shattered, and the ninth mountain was quaking. Its Xuanwu turtle was howling miserably, a howl filled with grief and unyielding madness. Meng Hao's heart was trembling, and intense grief filled the hearts of Sea Dream and the other powerful experts. Siddhigarbha was laughing bitterly. Everyone knew that utter defeat was inevitable. However, deep within their hearts, there was still a glimmer of hope. Although that hope was vague, it hadn't disappeared completely and clung to life like a candle flickering in the wind. Even as the army itself fought closer to the ninth mountain, Meng Hao and the other experts blocked the paragons of the 33 heavens. Of course, that also meant that they themselves could do nothing more in the fighting. Both sides were tying each other up. All of them could do little more than watch as the outsider army slowly and inexorably made its way toward the ninth mountain. Soon, the 4 great planets were under attack. The first to be destroyed was planet West Felicity. The entire planet was bombarded by countless outsider divine abilities and magical techniques until it finally collapsed into nothing more than rubble. Heaven and earth shook violently as countless lives were snuffed out. Next was planet North Reed. After the outsiders poured into the planet, it became nothing more than crumbled ruins in the starry sky. The sight was like a sharp knife stabbing into the hearts of all the surviving mountain and sea cultivators. Some began to laugh bitterly. They had already given up on the idea of surviving. Ignoring all feelings of exhaustion, they turned and went back to slaughtering the outsiders. However, the outsider army was vast, and the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were dying left and right. Although their madness struck fear and shock into the hearts of the outsiders, in the end, the mountain and sea realm's forces were too small. Eventually, a third boom rang out within the space around the ninth mountain. Meng Hao watched with his own eyes as Planet East Victory was transformed into ash. Impossible! Meng Hao's heart was trembling, and his eyes were bright red. He was still in the middle of fighting the large-headed cultivator and the Eight Essences female paragon, and could hardly believe that what he was seeing was actually happening. There in front of his very eyes, Planet East Victory exploded. The seventh mountain and sea was destroyed, meaning that Planet Tiger Cage is gone. That's impossible, and Planet East Victory was fused with the first-generation patriarch. How could he possibly be destroyed? This is impossible. Meng Hao's heart trembled as he then watched the outsider army fighting its way toward Planet South Heaven. At that point, he began to grow more anxious than ever. Although his heart was connected to Planet East Victory, his true home was Planet South Heaven. There's still hope. Looking around at the shattered ninth mountain, he saw the hopelessly outnumbered mountain and sea realm cultivators fighting against all odds. He watched the planets falling, and his heart was stabbed with pain. There must be hope. The windswept imperial lord hasn't appeared yet, nor has the successor of immortal ancient. Where is the windswept realm? If they haven't shown up yet, then there's still hope. The flames of war burned ever closer to Planet South Heaven. Planet South Heaven was Meng Hao's home, and was occupied by the Fang clan. Now that Planet East Victory was gone, everyone from the Fang clan was charging madly back in the direction of Planet South Heaven. As countless divine abilities were unleashed by the horde of outsiders, Planet South Heaven's spell formation appeared to defend the planet. At the same time as the spell formation activated, numerous figures appeared outside of Planet South Heaven. One of them was Emperor Tang himself, backed by an army of puppets clad in black armor. There was also Fang Ziyu Feng, Meng Li, Fang Yu, as well as all the other members of the Fang clan who stood guard on Planet South Heaven. Their eyes gleamed with determination. They had pledged their lives to Planet South Heaven and would die with it. I swore an oath to stand guard over Planet South Heaven for 100,000 years. Even as Fang Ziyu Feng's voice echoed out, grim and determined, the army of outsiders surged forth in attack. At the same time, all of the members of the Fang clan, as well as numerous other cultivators of the mountain and sea realm who were connected to Planet South Heaven in a multitude of ways, raced over to fight both on Planet South Heaven itself and in the skies beyond it. Meng Hao's eyes were completely bloodshot. Roaring, he turned to break free from the fight with the female paragon and the large-headed cultivator, heading toward Planet South Heaven with all the speed he could muster to join his friends and family. His parents and sister were there, and all his fellow clan members. Fatty, Chen Fan, Wang Yaokai, and Sun Hai were all racing in the same direction, as was Su Qing. In addition, there were Pill Demon and Qi Jiusi. Planet South Heaven was Meng Hao's weak spot. To him, it was the most important and meaningful place in the entire mountain and sea realm. Even Patriarch Reliance roared in fury as he fought his way toward Planet South Heaven, a place which was inextricably tied into his memories. Massive rumbling sounds echoed out. Planet South Heaven did not collapse like Planet East Victory had, thanks to the bloodline spell formation of the All-Heavenly clan. The spell formation fought back against the endless hordes of outsiders, and yet it was starting to fade. Emperor Tang laughed bitterly as he waved his hands, sending the innumerable black-armored puppets out to attack. They were joined by numerous vengeful ghosts which flew out from the spell formation. Among those ghosts were men and women, elderly and young. These were the Li clan cultivators who had sacrificed their own lives so many years ago. In life, they had been tasked with defending the mountain and sea realm, and they would do the same thing in death. Planet South Heaven was shaking, as the entire place turned into a shocking battlefield. Meng Hao wanted to return to Planet South Heaven, but there was someone who disagreed. "Think you can just come and go as you please," said the female paragon, eyes flickering with killing intent. Meng Hao had fought her relentlessly up to this point, putting her in numerous deadly crises. Although she now knew that he was an extremely powerful opponent, she still wanted to see him dead. Recalling what Paragon Xuan Fang had said before he died, the female paragon's desire to kill Meng Hao grew even more intense. As soon as she realized that he wanted to leave, her desire to stop him exploded out. "You aren't going anywhere. I'm going to force you to watch as everything you care about. is completely destroyed. Even as the female paragon began to chase Meng Hao, the large-headed cultivator hesitated. Although he had followed along with the plan to come to fight in this battle, he hadn't spoken much so far, which indicated the true feelings in his heart. He sighed, but after a moment passed, chose to cooperate. Using his incredible speed, he shot after Meng Hao to block his path. It was in that moment that rumbling sounds echoed out from planet South Heaven. Meng Hao caught sight of his father and mother surrounded by outsiders, coughing up blood. He saw Fatty and Wang Yaokai and all of his other friends arriving on the scene. He saw Su Qing laughing bitterly. He saw Patriarch Reliance roaring in fury, and he saw the alchemic flame within his master pill demon flickering as it charged up to self-detonate. Meng Hao was fearful, terrified, and his heart was being torn to pieces. A vicious expression appeared on his face as he let out a roar that caused heaven and earth to dim. Screw off. Chapter 1387, Planet South Heaven in Peril. Chapter 1388, We Mountain and Sea Cultivators. The large-headed cultivator and the female paragon were now facing the wrath of Meng Hao. Simultaneously, they unleashed essence power that transformed into a sea of light that blocked his path. Rumbling sounds rose up as Meng Hao shot forward and slammed head first into the sea of light, allowing it to envelop him as he fought his way forward. The female paragon was shocked, and the large-headed cultivator was visibly moved. They had just joined forces to unleash a shocking attack, but instead of evading, Meng Hao was trying to force his way through it. Booms could be heard as an asteroid formed around Meng Hao, which shattered after only a few breaths of time. Then he became an azure rock, which shattered just as quickly. Finally, the meat jelly appeared, gritting its teeth as it transformed into a suit of armor. It was only at that point that Meng Hao burst out from within the sea of light. "Want to pass? Never." A venomous gleam appeared in the female paragon's eyes, hatred for how Meng Hao had threatened her life during the recent fighting. She knew that he was powerful in terms of battle prowess, and that if he got past her, he would have a big influence on the fighting over planet South Heaven. Therefore, she steeled herself in an attempt to block Meng Hao's path. Neither Paragon Sea Dream, the Paragon Puppet, nor Shui Dongliu were capable of forming clones, and thus were completely tied down fighting Dao Fang and the other 8 essences Paragon. Kesidigarbha and the other mountain and sea lords and powerful experts, as well as Wang Yaokai and the other chosen who had recently become Dao sovereigns and imperial lords, were also caught up fighting their counterparts among the outsiders. Planet South Heaven was in critical danger. The starry sky trembled as the 9th mountain teetered on the verge of collapse. This was absolutely the most critical moment of danger so far. On planet South Heaven itself, everything was shaking and rumbling. The seas and rivers ran red with blood. Emperor Tang's black-armored puppets were fighting fiercely, as were the ghosts of the Li clan. Because of them, the power unleashed by the spell formation was even more shocking than before. At the moment, all outsiders who attempted to break through the battle lines to enter planet South Heaven were cut down. Unfortunately, despite how the outsiders were cut down, and despite the vast power of the spell formation itself, it was impossible for it to deal with the sheer numbers involved. The outsider army was too vast, and as they charged to their deaths in the spell formation, it began to grow dim. Meng Hao's parents were completely spattered in blood. His sister was fighting with every ounce of strength she could muster, and Sun Hai stood by, protecting her. There were even a few times in which he sustained serious injuries to keep her safe. Meng Hao saw all of this happening. He even saw his master pill demon fighting ferociously, his alchemic flame burning bright. Although his cultivation base wasn't incredibly high, the medicinal pills he summoned allowed him to bolster the other mountain and sea cultivators with his own alchemic flame. Fatty wept bitterly as he fought. Of his once flourishing group of beloved partners, more than half were dead. Fatty was enraged to the point of madness, eyes bloodshot as he took vicious bites out of the enemy forces. Chen Fan was taciturn and trembling. Although he was fighting and killing the outsiders, his mind seemed to be in another place. It was as if some important and weighty matter had filled him with conflicting thoughts, as if he couldn't see through things clearly and was struggling with a decision. Then there was Qi Jiusi, who was able to lock down significant swaths of the outsider army. In fact, because of Knight's divine ability, some of the outsiders, most powerful experts, were sucked away into ancient times to fight. To see everyone he knew in such bitter situations caused Meng Hao to tremble. His eyes burned with flames as he burst out of the sea of light, ready to fight. The large-headed cultivator instantly appeared in front of him and punched out with all of the power of his flesh and blood. A boom rang out, completely shaking Meng Hao. However, the counterstrike from Meng Hao was just as devastating. Both parties fell back, blood spraying out of their mouths. At the same time, the female paragon uttered a magical curse, causing the sea of light to twist and seethe, then explode out with power that inundated Meng Hao. "Want to get past here? I don't think so." The female paragon chuckled coldly, backing up as she performed a double-handed incantation gesture, causing the sea of light to expand. Moments later, Meng Hao roars could be heard from within. "You just don't know when to back down," the large-headed cultivator said slowly. However, even as the words left his mouth, a new sound echoed out with the roaring in the sea of light. Suddenly, booming sounds like that of a huge drum could be heard. Boom, boom, boom. It was almost as if a giant were walking about within that sea of light. After the sound echoed out 7 times, the sound of the roaring reached a level that was difficult to put into words. Then, a colorful beam of light shot out from inside the sea of light. It was none other than Meng Hao. He was covered in blood, but as he shot out, the starry sky trembled, and an indescribably murderous aura exploded out, seeming to freeze everything. The large-headed cultivator gritted his teeth, sending his cultivation base into full rotation as he slammed toward Meng Hao. Even as the boom of their collision rang out, the female paragon suddenly bit the tip of her tongue and spat out some blood. Her hands flashed in a double-handed incantation gesture, and she suddenly seemed to age as she unleashed a strange Taoist magic that caused the glob of blood to transform into a sea, a second barrier after the sea of light. After slamming into the large-headed cultivator, Meng Hao ignored any subsequent injuries to fly around the man, only to find a sea of blood now standing in his way. A boom rang out and the sea churned. The female paragon let out a miserable cry and her hair was thrown into disarray. She was shaking, and her skin was covered in rips and tears. However, the sea of blood held and would not allow Meng Hao to pass. "You shall not pass," the woman screamed. Meng Hao was stuck inside of the sea of blood, his face pale, his body trembling. It was at that point that, without the slightest hesitation, he produced the sun bow and drew upon his life force to unleash 2 arrows. The first arrow pierced through the sea of blood, destroying more than half of it. The second arrow shot toward the female paragon herself, causing her eyes to widen as she fell back. This in turn caused the large-headed cultivator, who had initially been focused on blocking Meng Hao's progress, to change his plan and move to save the female paragon. All of this happened in the time it takes a spark to fly off of a piece of flint. After shooting the 2 arrows, Meng Hao's body was significantly withered, but his eyes gleamed with determination. Ignoring everything else, he unleashed the top speed he could muster to shoot toward planet South Heaven. Unfortunately, he was a bit too late. Outside of planet South Heaven, Fang Wei was laughing. His eyes gleamed with ferocity, madness, and slaughter. He had lost his right arm, his left arm, and both his legs. However, he still had his torso. "I am Fang Wei. The Wei in my name means to defend the Fang clan." As he fought on madly, other members of the Fang clan chose to self-detonate, sending explosive power out to bury the outsiders. The Grand Elder fell in battle. Fang Yangsu was there, hair in disarray, drenched in blood. Letting out a piercing cry, he self-detonated. One chosen after another fell in battle. There were many faces familiar to Meng Hao, and some which were strangers. However, as their voices rang out in the moments before their deaths, they became like swords that stabbed Meng Hao in the heart. His parents were injured, Fang Yu was injured, Su Qing was injured. Wounds crisscrossed Chen Fan and Sun Hai. Booms filled planet South Heaven as the last of the black-armored puppets was destroyed. Emperor Tang laughed bitterly as countless outsiders blasted away at the Li clan spell formation. Clearly, it was on the verge of complete collapse. "The Li clan is one of the all-heaven clans," he said. "Back then, we sacrificed our lives to create this spell formation. Today, we will make another sacrifice. Why wouldn't we die for the mountain and sea realm? We mountain and sea cultivators live and die for the mountains and seas." Emperor Tang's laughter grew louder and louder as he charged into the fighting, joined by the countless Li clan ghosts from the spell formation. One living cultivator led the ghosts of his clan into a deadly offensive, slaughtering their way into the army of outsiders, killing one after another after another. In the end, Emperor Tang's laughter rang out as he decisively shouted out in a voice that echoed through all heaven and earth. "We mountain and sea cultivators live and die for the mountains and seas." BO1 and MM. When he chose to self-detonate, the last living member of the Li clan exploded, after which all of the ghosts also began to explode. In truth, the ghosts themselves could not self-detonate. What was exploding was planet South Heaven's spell formation. The Li clan ghosts, the structure of the entire South Heaven death formation, were all exploding. The spell formation shook all of the lands, sending out a shockwave that blasted away all wind and clouds. The spell formation itself became resplendent light, and a screaming tempest that raged out in all directions. The outsiders in the army were astonished, and those looks of shock were the last expressions to appear on their faces for all eternity. The blast rattled out, transforming one outsider after another into nothing more than ash. The huge boom caused all fighters in the war to turn their heads to look. Outsiders and mountain and sea cultivators alike couldn't help but look over. What they saw was the shockwave of the spell formation spreading out in a ring, wiping out more than 40% of the outsider army around planet South Heaven. The Li clan was an all-heaven clan, a remnant of the true forces who had fought in the original war of the Paragon Immortal Realm. They swore to defend the mountain and sea realm, and on this day, they lived up to their oath of tens upon tens of thousands of years. Each and every member of the clan died. Not a single successor to the bloodline remained. A wave of grief swept up into the hearts and minds of all of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. We mountain and sea cultivators live and die for the mountains and seas. Those words echoed out into their minds, affixing themselves there for all time. Chapter 1389, Stand Behind Me. Outside of planet South Heaven, there were still millions of outsiders who were trembling after having just survived a horrific catastrophe. It was something they would never be able to forget. However, now that the spell formation was gone, planet South Heaven had lost its defenses. Gradually, the outsiders' eyes began to glow red. It was hard to say who began the charge, but soon, the entire army was raging toward planet South Heaven. It was also in this moment that, at the very apex of the starry sky, in the location where the 33 heavens came from, things had been very silent since the descent of Dao Fang. But now, the starry sky there began to distort, as though a force of killing intent was pushing its way in. At some undetectable location in the starry sky bordering the mountain and sea realm in the vast expanse, a huge land mass was rumbling along, crushing anything that got in its way. Dragging that land mass along were 9 huge suns, radiating dazzling light. They were coming. Back on planet South Heaven, the remnants of the spell formation were dissipating. As the millions of outsiders barreled forth in attack, cracks and crevices began to appear on the surface of the planet. Planet South Heaven was on the brink of collapsing. All of the cultivators on the planet were coughing up blood, and up in the sky, countless outsiders appeared and began to fight viciously. From the look of things, all creation on South Heaven existed in the shadows of the outsiders. Planet South Heaven was now in a moment of indescribable crisis. Meng Hao's father Fang Ziyufeng coughed up a mouthful of blood as a hail of flying swords stabbed into him. When Meng Hao saw that happen, the entire world seemed to grind to a halt. Even as he burst out from within the sea of blood, these were the images which filled his eyes. No, eyes bloodshot, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, blasting a path through the outsider army. Countless outsiders screamed miserably as they were transformed into ash. Meng Hao shot with indescribable speed through the path he had created, arriving at planet South Heaven just in time to catch his father as he began to fall down after having been stabbed through by numerous flying swords. At the same time, he unleashed a vicious blow onto the lands down below. The ground quaked and yet was not destroyed. Instead, the power rebounded, shooting up into the sky, causing a massive force to slam into the outsiders. Miserable cries could be heard from the outsiders in the area as massive pressure slammed into them, causing them to explode. Instantly, all heaven and earth was filled with a rain of outsider blood. The outsiders who were still off in the distance gasped. Looking at Meng Hao in astonishment, they began to back up, not daring to get close at all. Meng Hao's hair was whipping around his head. He was like a volcano erupting with a murderous aura so intense it darkened everything. Fang Ziyufeng was critically injured, but it wasn't a fatal blow. Seeing Meng Hao appear so suddenly, he smiled, a smile filled with warmth, pride, and delight. The arrival of Meng Hao caused excitement to ripple through the members of the Fang clan, and all the other cultivators on planet South Heaven began to cry out passionately. Meng Hao, Crown Prince! The Crown Prince is back, countless cries echoed out. Tears streamed down Meng Li's face as she helped Fang Ziyufeng out of Meng Hao's arms. There was no time for Meng Hao to reminisce. Seeing the bloodshot eyes of Su Qing, Fatty, Chen Fan, Sun Hai, and his sister Fang Yu, and the wounds which covered them, Meng Hao's fury rose to new heights. Without speaking another word, he turned and unleashed his magical techniques and divine abilities. The Paragon Bridge rumbled out, and the mountain-consuming incantation caused countless mountains to appear. The nearby outsiders were incapable of evading. Considering the disparity between their cultivation bases and Meng Hao's, vast casualties were inflicted. Meng Hao seemed completely maddened as he charged out to unleash more slaughter. However, it was at this point that the large-headed cultivator and the female paragon came speeding over from off in the distance. Venomous hatred flickered in the paragon's eyes as she performing an incantation gesture, then hit herself on the top of the head. Instantly, a violet pearl shot out from her mouth, which transformed into a violet sea. The large-headed cultivator frowned, and then his body distorted as an intense level of power erupted off of him, which merged into the violet sea as it shot toward Meng Hao. A vicious expression twisted Meng Hao's face as he lifted the sun bow and fired 3 arrows. Shooting 3 arrows caused him to cough up blood and lose vast quantities of life force. 3 arrows was his limit. 3 shocking arrows. The first was like a dragon that shot toward the large-headed cultivator, and when it slammed into him, blood sprayed out of his mouth as he was sent tumbling backward. Simultaneously, the second arrow closed in on him. The third arrow stabbed through the violet sea toward the female paragon, causing her eyes to widen. However, the large-headed cultivator was unable to extricate himself from his own danger to rescue her, so she had no choice but to grit her teeth and let the arrow stab through her. Instantly, she exploded. However, it didn't result in her death. After exploding, she reformed, whereupon her face was ashen, and the hatred in her eyes toward Meng Hao was even greater than before. "I'm going to skin you alive," she screamed. The life-saving magic she had just used came at a price, and that price was that she would never again be able to attain an 8 essences cultivation base. Because of the 3 spikes that had been stabbed into her, she had already been placed in a situation where it would have been difficult to return to the 8 essences level. However, the life-saving magic she had just used fractured her Tao foundation, ensuring that it would never be possible. Simultaneously, blood sprayed out of the mouth of the large-headed cultivator, whose body was half destroyed after dealing with the second arrow. However, he quickly began to form back together, and at the same time, a powerful gravitational force appeared, which shredded tens of thousands of nearby outsiders to pieces. In the blink of an eye, he absorbed them and was back at his peak level of power. "You've already reached your limit with those arrows," he said. "I didn't really want to kill you today, but we're on different sides. Please forgive me." After a moment, the large-headed cultivator sighed and then began to stride toward Meng Hao. The female paragon's hair was completely disheveled, and she was filled with unending venom. Once again, she slapped her forehead, spitting out a mouthful of blood that was mixed with chunks of internal organs. The blood rapidly transformed into a corrupt and defiled sea of blood which was far stronger than any of the other seas of blood she had produced. Shockingly, she even managed to pack some of her sealed and weakened essence into the sea of blood, making it burst with a power that rivaled the 8 essences level. That was something she normally wouldn't ever do, not even if the 33 heavens were about to lose the entire war. After all, she cared mostly about herself, and as long as there were some way to escape the situation, she would take it. But now, her Tao foundation has been crushed, dooming her to never again reach the 8 essences level. Her hatred had reached the level of insanity, and she therefore didn't hesitate to spit out her sealed essence, all in exchange for the chance to unleash an 8 essences divine ability. Corrupt your heart, defile your Tao foundation. I call upon my life force magic to decimate your blood and send your soul into eternal destruction. Gritting her teeth, she glared at Meng Hao and the surrounding members of the Fang clan. "And not just you, but your whole clan. Do you really think I wasn't aware that the damned heaven-severing Diyin was connected to you people by soul and blood?" That was one of the main reasons for her hatred for both Meng Hao and the Fang clan. Even as the words left her mouth, the corrupt, defiled sea of blood shot toward Meng Hao so quickly that he had no chance to avoid or dodge it. Meng Hao instantly unleashed all of the power of his cultivation base, and yet it did nothing to the sea of blood. The Paragon Bridge, and even his hexing magic were all powerless to prevent it from boring into the pores in his body. The intense pain caused him to let out a blood-curdling scream. His eyes bulged, and blue veins popped out all over his face. However, This divine ability had been unleashed by the female paragon at the cost of a huge sacrifice, and was something he couldn't match up to. The corrupt and defiled blood vanished into him, filling every part of his body. Instantly, it began to cancel out his own blood, to attack his heart, to defile and corrupt his internal organs. He had already been weak and injured, but now he was shaking even more violently, and his consciousness was fading. He almost seemed incapable of standing upright, and did so only by sheer willpower. Inside, he was screaming and struggling against the effects. "Kill them all," the female paragon said. Then she coughed up a mouthful of blood and sat down cross-legged, using her divine sense to manipulate the corrupt and defiled blood inside of Meng Hao. She planned to wipe him away for good. Clearly, she wished to vent her hatred for the heaven-severing Dian upon the entire Fang clan. That hatred, coupled with the fact that Meng Hao had injured her so severely, ensured that she was devoted to the idea of destroying his Dao foundation. Roaring battle cries rang out as the outsider army once again charged forth in attack. The large-headed cultivator sighed quietly and chose not to do anything. He stood off the side, watching everything play out. Deep within his eyes, he seemed somewhat confused, as if he were pondering whether or not this war should ever have been fought. Outside of planet South Heaven, near the Ninth Mountain, mountain and sea cultivators were self-detonating, dying, and being shoved back across the battlefield, as countless outsiders continued to fill the Ninth Mountain. The Ninth Mountain was teetering, filled with countless invisible cracks and fissures which left it on the verge of being completely destroyed. The mountain and sea realm was left with a single, crumbling mountain and a broken planet. Meng Hao was trembling in the sky above planet South Heaven as the female paragon personally attempted to erode his Tao. As his blood was burned away, he continued to inch toward unconsciousness. Even his cultivation base was falling. Laughing bitterly, Meng Hao coughed up a mouthful of black blood filled with countless vile chunks of flesh. Gritting his teeth, he looked around at his compatriots, then rotated what was left of his cultivation base and said to them, "Stand behind me." With that, he strode forward to fight against the outsiders. Note from Urgen: I know there are some fellow Taoists who aren't very happy with this war. It's also been exhausting to write it. However, the events of the war were finalized in my original outline for the story. Thankfully, we will be reaching the conclusion of the war soon, and I won't be writing anything like this again in the story. /expand. Meng Hao was already having trouble standing. The outsiders were on the verge of killing his family, his friends, and all the other cultivators on South Heaven. He clenched his jaw and drew upon all the energy in his body to unleash a deadly attack, all to defend the people he cared about. Everyone began to cry out. "Hey Yar! Meng Hao! Crown Prince!" Su Qing wept and walked up to Meng Hao to help support him. However, Meng Hao pushed her to the side and reached out to grab an outsider who had been sneaking up to attack her from behind. He grabbed the outsider by the throat, and then cracking sounds echoed out as its neck was crushed. "Get behind me," he said, panting. Then his hands flashed in a double-handed incantation gesture as he once again unleashed destruction upon the outsider army. And yet there only seemed to be more and more outsiders, and Meng Hao was getting weaker and weaker. Off in the distance, the Paragon puppet's eyes flickered, and energy erupted off of it as it tried to head in Meng Hao's direction, only to be blocked by the other 8 essences Paragon. Paragon Sea Dream was also locked down, and couldn't get close to planet South Heaven. Shui Dongliu sighed, and a conflicted expression appeared on his face for a moment before fading away. "Everything is for the mountain and sea realm," he murmured in a voice that only he could hear. He sighed inwardly. The seal on planet South Heaven cannot be unraveled by a mountain and sea cultivator, only the outsiders. Plus, the right propelling souls are still required. It's almost time. Almost time. Even as he waved a hand to unleash another attack upon Dao Fang, he looked up at the very end of the starry sky up above. A miserable cry rang out on planet South Heaven. Meng Hao was trembling, and his cultivation base was dropping rapidly. The 8 essences female paragon had paid an incredible price to unleash a divine ability that he could scarcely defend against. The power of that divine ability was relentlessly attempting to corrupt his blood and defile his body. Everything began to go blurry, and countless voices were crying out in his ears. There were angry roars, boastful taunts, miserable shrieks, and bitter weeping. "Die," he said softly. He once again burst out toward the surrounding outsiders, leaving behind a trail of blood and death. Outsider corpses were piling up everywhere. His left arm was broken, but he had his right. He gritted his teeth as his cultivation base continued to drop. Waving his right hand, he summoned numerous mountains. With each step he took, gale-force winds swept about, and the attacking outsiders were destroyed. He was protecting the people he cared for and loved. He didn't want to see his friends and family hurt. His mind was empty, devoid of any thoughts except that determination. Countless outsiders roared as they attacked, and even though he was slipping closer toward unconsciousness, his desire to kill was no less. His right arm was broken, but he merely gritted his teeth in response. His legs were crushed, but he ignored the pain. Defiant, shocking roars echoed out in all directions. The Fang clan cultivators, Fatty, Meng Hao's parents, and all the other mountain and sea cultivators unleashed attacks in all directions. Thanks to the protection being offered by Meng Hao, some of them were wounded, but none were in danger of losing their lives. However, the price paid by Meng Hao was that his cultivation base continued to drop dangerously. The large-headed cultivator hovered there silently. Next to him was the female paragon, brow furrowed in concentration as she directed her divine ability. Meng Hao was burning his life force. Exhaustion engulfed him like floodwaters. His vision was now not just growing blurry, it was also darkening. He wasn't sure how many outsiders he had killed, but it seemed like no matter how many he cut down, more appeared in their place. He was weak beyond belief. He attempted to summon his soul lamps, to extinguish them as a way to recover. However, because of the corruption of his blood, his soul lamps were defiled, and he could not summon them. He began to headbutt the outsiders, causing black blood to spray out of his mouth. His cultivation base continued to fall. Behind him, all those he was protecting were injured, maddened, and begrieved. Tears streamed down their faces as they looked at Meng Hao there in front of them, as solid as a mountain. An endless field of outsider corpses stretched out in front of him, beyond which was the seemingly infinite army. They looked at Meng Hao with fear and shock. He was no longer equivalent to a paragon. His cultivation base had dropped, and he was teetering on the verge of collapse. However, the intense murderous aura which radiated out of him could shake heaven and earth. As he stood there surrounded by death, energy surging, the outsiders were so frightened that they didn't dare to advance any further. Conflicted expressions could be seen as they looked at Meng Hao. Cultivators like him were rare in the 33 heavens, but after invading the mountain and sea realm, they had seen one after another. And now they were facing Meng Hao. For the moment the battlefield went silent, and although Meng Hao's eyes were somewhat blank, he managed to quietly say, "Kinger, bind my wounds." Su Qing approached, tears streaming down her ashen face. She ripped a strip of cloth off of her garment, and as all of the nearby outsiders and Fang clan cultivators watched, she wrapped it tightly around his broken right arm. Seeing her tears, he murmured, "Don't cry, tighter now, otherwise it might slip." Su Qing bit her lip and quietly bound the other arm, making sure the bandages were tight. Even as the outsiders stood there, terrified and unwilling to advance, the female paragon's eyes opened and she cried out shrilly, "Kill them all." Her voice and her status ensured that the outsiders only hesitated for a moment before erupting with powerful roars. Then, the army surged like floodwaters toward Meng Hao. Planet South Heaven trembled, and crevices opened up all over its surface. Apparently, it was on the very brink of collapsing. As Meng Hao stood there, fighting to clear his vision, the mastiff flew out from his bag of holding, roaring as it charged into the outsiders. The blood demon ripped open a rift and emerged, and Meng Hao's blood spirit appeared, both of whom attacked the outsiders viciously. Meng Hao's legs were shattered, making it impossible to walk, but he stood there like a mountain, allowing the virtual sea of outsiders to bash into him. And yet, he didn't fall. His right hand shot out to lock around the neck of one outsider, while his left fist slammed into the chest of another. Outsiders were launching divine abilities at him from all directions, but even as they slammed into him, he head-butted another outsider. This disturbing scene left the outsiders completely shocked. The mastiff was fighting like mad, a streak of red light flying about. Soon, there were simply too many outsiders, so the mastiff grabbed Meng Hao with its teeth, sustaining severe injuries as it dragged him back toward the Fang clan cultivators. Blood oozed out of the corners of Meng Hao's mouth. His cultivation base had already dropped below the immortal realm. His fellow clan members, his family, and his friends were all weeping from the tragedy of what was happening. Meng Hao struggled to rise to his feet, when all of a sudden a hand clasped softly onto his shoulder. It was Fang Ziyufeng. He had sustained serious injuries, and yet his hand still radiated intense pressure as he looked down at Meng Hao. Hayar, allow father to step in. If you survive this, make sure to take care of yourself in the future. With that, Fang Ziyufeng took a deep breath, and without giving Meng Hao a chance to say or do anything, strode forward toward the outsiders. He was Meng Hao's father, and he wouldn't sit idly by while his own son fought for him. He was Fang Ziyufeng. He had been the greatest chosen of the Fang clan. He was the clan chief, but what he was most proud of was that he was Meng Hao's father. Today is the day that the mountain and sea realm dies and the Fang clan dies. You want to wipe us out to end a blood feud. Well, if even a drop of Fang clan blood survives, then no matter how many years pass, we will get revenge. As Fang Ziyufeng strode out, vast numbers of Fang clan cultivators joined him to attack the outsiders. Earlier, Meng Hao had been protecting them, but now they would protect Meng Hao. Rumbling echoed out as the slaughter began. By this point, the cultivators of the Fang clan had reached a state of madness that exceeded that of any of the other mountain and sea cultivators in the fight so far. The boom of self-detonations began to ring out. Blood oozed out of the corners of Meng Hao's mouth, and his vision faded even more. He heard the countless miserable shrieks echoing in his ears. Everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. He saw fellow clan members self-detonating. He saw his father there in the middle of the outsider army, slaughtering the enemy. However, he was already wounded, and suddenly an outsider landed a heavy blow on his chest. He fell back, killing the outsider, but unable to avoid a flying sword which stabbed into his heart. The sword stabbed through him, causing a spray of blood to erupt out of him like a fountain. Meng Hao was shaking, and his eyes were wide. As he watched everything happen, he wanted to make everything stop, but was unable to change anything. As the sword stabbed through Fang Ziyufeng, he let out an indomitable roar, and then he looked back at his wife. He looked at his daughter, and he looked at his son. In the past, he had intentionally looked at his son with awe and reverence, something that a father normally wouldn't do. But he was willing to do just that. He was willing to set the example for others. He knew that Meng Hao was actually soft-hearted, and that he needed to learn about the bitterness of war. He needed to grow up in a way that could only be done in the most bitter of battles. He had come to the realization long ago that he wouldn't be able to stand by Meng Hao's side forever. Eventually, the day would come when he wouldn't be there, and when that happened, he hoped that his son could be strong. His love for Meng Hao was just like Qi Yunhai's love for Qi Jiusi. It was profound and filled with hope. Today, he stepped out to fight knowing that he would die. He knew that considering the level of Meng Hao's cultivation base, he shouldn't be in such danger right now. Fang Ziyufeng knew that it was only because of himself and the other clan members. He didn't want to be a hindrance to Meng Hao, and because of that, because of the incredible danger Meng Hao was facing, Fang Ziyufeng chose to ensure that no such hindrance existed. Your path still stretches far out into the future. As father and son gazed into each other's eyes, Meng Hao's heart felt like it was tearing apart. He felt confusion gnawing at him and fear. "Dad," he mouthed, unable to give voice to the word. Fang Ziyufeng smiled, then closed his eyes. "Farewell, my Hayar." When he opened his eyes, they shone with a bright light as he chose to self-detonate. His injuries were severe, so he knew that even if he didn't self-detonate, he would die in the fighting. Instead, he would tell everyone, "I am Fang Ziyufeng. Live and die for the mountains and seas." The boom that echoed out was not an unusual sound on the battlefield, but to Meng Hao, it was as if all heaven and earth were shaking. It was a sound that reaved the heavens and sundered the earth. Meng Hao's entire world was completely shattered. Chapter 1390, Farewell, my Hayar.